She didn't cry when the train pulled away. She cried when she realized no one was coming. Clara Whitmore stood alone on that platform. One battered suitcase, one crumpled letter, and the sound of her own heartbeat drowning out everything else. The station master's words were still ringing in her ears. "Your brother passed 2 months ago, miss. I'm sorry." 2 months. He'd been gone 2 months. And she'd crossed half a country believing he was waiting for her. If you've ever arrived somewhere and found nothing but silence, you already know how this feels. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The letter had been folded and unfolded so many times that the paper had gone soft at the creases, almost like fabric. Clara Whitmore knew every word by heart. She didn't need to read it again. But she read it anyway, standing there in the middle of Silver Creek's tiny train depot, while the last passengers filed out around her, while strangers bumped her shoulder and muttered, "Excuse me," without looking up, while the world moved on the way it always did. Indifferent, unhurried, completely unaware that her entire life had just collapsed underneath her feet. "Come west. Clara," the letter said in her brother Thomas's careful handwriting. "Come to Colorado. I have land here. I have a house. You'll have a room of your own and work that means something. Nobody out here knows your name or your story. You can start over. You can breathe again. I promise you, little sister out here, you won't have to spend another day living under the weight of what they said about you." She pressed the letter flat against her palm. Thomas Whitmore, her big brother, the only person in the world who had never once looked at her with pity or suspicion or that particular brand of quiet disgust, that polite Boston society reserved for women who had been publicly disgraced whether they deserved it or not. And he was dead. 2 months in the ground, according to the station master. A tired-looking man named Henderson, who had delivered the news with the practiced grimness of someone who'd delivered bad news 100 times and still hadn't figured out how to make it land softly. Fever took him fast, Henderson had said, not quite meeting her eyes. "I'm real sorry, Miss Whitmore. He was a good man. Talked about you sometimes. Said you were coming eventually." Eventually. As if Thomas had known she'd wait too long. As if he'd somehow anticipated that she would spend 6 months arguing with herself before finally buying a ticket. 6 months, telling herself she wasn't a burden. She wasn't running away. She wasn't desperate. Right up until the morning she woke up and realized she was all 3 of those things, and she didn't care anymore. She'd sold everything she owned to buy that ticket. Every book. Every piece of good china. The pearl earrings her mother had left her, which she had sworn 100 times she would never sell. She sold them. For a train ticket to Colorado. To a brother who was already dead before she even packed her bag. "Miss." She looked up. Henderson was watching her from behind his small window, his expression caught somewhere between sympathy and discomfort. He clearly wanted her to leave. The depot was empty now. The platform was quiet. The train that had brought her here had long since disappeared around the bend, and the sound of it, that low receding rumble, had left behind a silence so complete, it felt like a physical thing pressing against her chest. "Is there somewhere you need to go?" Henderson asked carefully. "Someone I can send word to?" "No," Clara said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "There's no one." Henderson shifted his weight. "There's a boarding house on Main Street. Mrs. Patterson runs it. She's a decent woman. Not cheap, but she won't turn you away for the night." Clara opened her small purse and looked at the coins inside. She counted them without moving her lips. Then she closed the purse again. "Thank you," she said. She picked up her suitcase and walked toward the door. She didn't run. She had decided somewhere on that long train ride through the flat plains and then the rising mountains that she was done running. Running was what had brought her here. Running from Boston. Running from the whispers. Running from the memory of standing in a courthouse hallway while a man she had trusted looked straight through her as if she didn't exist, as if she had never existed, while his lawyer explained in calm and measured tones that Miss Whitmore's account of events was simply not credible. Not credible. She had walked out of that building with her head up and her hands steady, and she had not cried until she was 3 blocks away, alone in an alley with her back against a brick wall, and her knees finally giving out beneath her. She had been not credible for 6 months after that. Not credible in her landlord's eyes when she fell behind on rent. Not credible when she asked her father's old colleagues for a reference. Not credible when she sat across a desk from 3 different employers and watched their expressions shift the moment her name connected to the story they'd read in the papers. That Clara Whitmore. That's the one. She had spent 6 months being a story that other people told, and now she was standing in Silver Creek, Colorado, with a dead brother, a near-empty purse, and no plan whatsoever. She pushed open the depot door. The cold hit her first. Colorado cold was nothing like Boston cold. Boston cold was wet and gray and got into your bones like water seeping through old mortar. This cold was sharp and dry and high mountain air coming down off peaks she could barely see in the fading light. And it was beautiful in a way that almost hurt the way beautiful things sometimes do when you're in no position to appreciate them. She stood on the platform steps and looked at Silver Creek. It wasn't much. A main street with maybe 24 storefronts. A church steeple visible above the rooftops. A saloon with warm light spilling out of its windows. Horses tied to posts. A few people moving between buildings with their heads down against the wind. Nobody was looking at her. In Boston, she had walked down streets feeling like every pair of eyes was tracking her, cataloging her failures, updating their mental files on the woman who had made accusations she couldn't prove and ruined her own reputation in the process. Here, not one single person looked up. She was invisible. She wasn't sure yet whether that was a blessing or the loneliest feeling she'd ever had. Probably both. Probably at the same time. She stepped down off the platform and started walking toward the lights of Main Street, her suitcase heavy in her hand, her boots too thin for the ground, her mind running the same loop. It had been running for 3 days on the train. What do you do now, Clara? What exactly do you do now? She was so deep inside that loop that she almost didn't hear the hoofbeats. Almost. She heard them slow down behind her, then stop. She kept walking. In her experience, strange men on horseback who stopped near women traveling alone were not generally a comfort. Miss Whitmore. She stopped, not because the voice scared her, because it said her name. Her actual name spoken by someone who clearly expected an answer. Not the flat, careful way Henderson, the station master, had said it, the way you say the name of someone you feel sorry for, but with something else in it. Recognition. Certainty. She turned around. The man on horseback was tall. She could tell even from the ground, even in the fading light. He had the look of someone who spent most of his time outdoors, dark from the sun, lean in a way that suggested hard work, rather than lack of food, with a wide-brimmed hat that he was already lifting off his head. He had dark eyes that were watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. Not pity, not suspicion. Something quieter than either of those. "I'm Wyatt Callahan," he said. "I knew your brother." Clara stood very still. "Thomas talked about you," Wyatt continued. His voice was low and unhurried, the kind of voice that had probably never rushed a sentence in its life. "Said you might be coming. I've been watching for the afternoon trains for the last couple weeks." He paused. "I'm sorry I wasn't there when you got in. I got held up on the south pasture, and by the time I rode in—" "You were watching for me," Clara said. Something about that. Just that made her throat tighten in a way she hadn't expected. She'd spent 6 months with people looking away from her. The idea of someone watching for her, actually anticipating her arrival, felt almost foreign. "Thomas asked me to," Wyatt said simply. "Before he passed. He said you were going to need someone to be there when you stepped off that train. He said you'd never admit it, but you would." Clara looked away. She pressed her lips together. "I was right," she said after a moment. "About most things. He was a good man." "Yes," she said. "He was." They were both quiet for a moment. Wind moved between them, carrying dust and the smell of pine from somewhere up the mountain. Then Wyatt said, "Miss Whitmore, you don't have to stand out here alone anymore. You're safe now." Simple words. 4 of them really, if you collapse the contraction. You're safe now. Clara had been told many things by many people over the past several years. She'd been told she was mistaken. She'd been told she was confused. She'd been told she was ungrateful, hysterical, dishonest, damaged. She'd been told by a man who had looked her in the eye across a dinner table and called her brave, that she had misunderstood the entire situation, that she'd built something out of nothing, that she was at bottom simply not the kind of woman whose word held weight in the world. Nobody had told her she was safe in a very long time. She felt the words land somewhere deep and unguarded, somewhere she hadn't been able to protect, and she hated herself a little for it, for how much those 4 words mattered, for how much she had apparently needed to hear them without even knowing it. "I don't know you," she said. Her voice came out carefully controlled. "I don't have any reason to trust you." Wyatt nodded slowly, as if this were a completely reasonable response. "No," he said. "You don't. My brother trusted you." "He did. He trusted a lot of people he shouldn't have." Wyatt tilted his head slightly, considering this. "Maybe," he said. "But he also had good instincts about character when he wasn't being too generous. You knew him better than I did. Was he a fool about people?" Clara thought about Thomas. Thomas, who had lent money to a neighbor who never paid it back and never mentioned it again. Thomas, who had argued with their father for 3 years over Clara's education, insisting she deserved the same books, the same tutors, the same conversations at the dinner table. Thomas, who had been the only one in the family courtroom in Boston, sitting in the back row with his hat in his hands and his jaw set, who had looked at her and nodded, just nodded as if to say, "I know. I believe you. Whatever happens, I know." "No," she admitted. "He wasn't a fool." "Then maybe trust his judgment a little while you work on trusting mine." She looked at him for a long moment. He didn't press her, didn't add anything, just held her gaze steadily, his hat still in his hand, his horse patient and still beside him, as if they had all the time in the world, as if time out here worked differently, which maybe it did. "Where is your ranch?" she asked finally. "About 4 miles north, Callahan Valley. And what would I be exactly if I came there?" Something flickered in his expression. Not amusement exactly, but something adjacent to it. Respect, maybe. The recognition that she was asking the right questions. "A guest," he said. "Just a guest, Thomas's sister. You'd have a room, you'd have meals, you'd have time to figure out what you want to do next. And in exchange, nothing." She stared at him. "That's not how the world works." "No," he agreed. "It isn't. But that's what I'm offering anyway." He looked at her for a moment, then added very quietly, "Your brother was good to a lot of people in this valley, Miss Whitmore. Himself included, me included. Letting you have somewhere safe to land while you find your feet, that's not charity. That's a debt I'm glad to pay." Clara stood there in the gathering dark of Silver Creek's empty street, and she thought about all the reasons to say no. She was good at reasons to say no. She had spent 6 months in Boston saying no to help she needed out of pride, out of stubbornness, out of a bone-deep fear that accepting anything from anyone would mean owing something she couldn't pay back, which was really just fear that she would be beholden, which was really just fear that she would be trapped again, which was really just the same fear she'd had ever since the night everything fell apart. The fear of being at someone else's mercy and finding out that mercy in the end was just another kind of power. But Thomas had trusted this man. And Thomas, who had never been a fool, had spent his last weeks asking this man to watch for her at the train depot. "All right," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she intended. "All right, Mr. Callahan." She watched something settle in his expression. Not triumph, not satisfaction, but something gentler. Relief, maybe, as if he'd been holding his breath without showing it. "Wyatt," he said. "Out here it's just Wyatt." He swung down off his horse with the ease of someone who'd done it 10,000 times, took her suitcase before she could protest, tied it behind the saddle, and then with a straightforwardness that somehow contained more respect than any of the elaborate courtesies she'd been offered, and withdrawn over the past 6 months, offered her a hand up. Clara took it. She hadn't been on a horse in years. She was cold. Her dress was wrong for this country. Her boots were wrong. Everything about her probably was wrong for this country. She got up anyway. And Wyatt Callahan said nothing at all about her shaking hands, or her too thin coat, or the tear that had tracked itself down her right cheek sometime in the last 5 minutes without her permission. He just turned the horse north and rode. 4 miles in the dark can feel like a very long time, or it can feel like almost nothing depending on the company. Clara and Wyatt rode mostly in silence, which she was grateful for. She was not in a state to make conversation. She was in a state of something she couldn't quite name. Not peace exactly, but a temporary suspension of panic, as if she had been holding her breath for so long that she'd forgotten what normal breathing felt like, and now she was trying to remember without drawing attention to the process. The sky out here was enormous in a way that still startled her. She was used to Boston sky's narrow strips of gray visible between buildings, stars you had to look for deliberately. Out here the sky was just present, the whole dome of it, and the stars were so many and so bright that they looked almost theatrical, like someone had overdone it. Thomas had mentioned the stars in one of his letters. The stars out here, Clara, you wouldn't believe. On clear nights I stand outside, and I feel so small I could laugh. She thought about that. Feeling small enough to laugh. She'd felt small for 6 months, and hadn't laughed once. "Can I ask you something?" she said, breaking the silence without planning to. "You can ask me anything," Wyatt said. "What did Thomas tell you about me, about why I was coming?" She felt, rather than saw, the slight shift in how he held himself. Careful, but not evasive. "He said you'd had a hard couple of years," Wyatt said. "He said you'd been blamed for something that wasn't your fault, and it had cost you most of what you had. He said you were the kind of woman who wouldn't tell anyone how bad it was, which meant by the time you showed up, it would probably be worse than anyone guessed." Clara said nothing for a moment. "Did he tell you what I was blamed for?" "He did. And nothing," Wyatt said simply and without hesitation. "Not my business, and even if it was, Thomas believed you. That's enough for me." Something sharp moved through her chest. She turned her face away from him toward the dark shapes of the mountains. "Most people didn't find it that simple," she said. "Most people aren't worth as much as they think they are," he said. She almost laughed. It surprised her, the almost laugh, the way a sudden light surprises you in a dark room, startling before its welcome. "You're very direct," she said. "It saves time," he said. "We've got a lot of ground to cover." The ranch house was lit when they arrived. Warm light in the windows. Real warmth, not the cold, elegant lamp glow of the houses she'd grown up around, but something more like firelight spilling out into the dark, with a kind of generosity that made the whole building look absurdly like it was glad to see you. A woman appeared in the doorway before they'd even tied the horse. A woman of perhaps 60, broad-shouldered and straight-backed, with iron-gray hair pulled back, and an expression on her face that Clara would later come to understand was simply how Martha Bell looked at everything directly, without flinching, and without any particular attempt to make you comfortable before she'd made up her mind about you. "This her," Martha called out. "This is her," Wyatt said. Martha came down the porch steps and stopped in front of Clara. She looked at her, really looked the kind of looking that catalogs things that take stock, and Clara stood still and let her do it too, tired to perform, too wrung out to pretend. Then Martha said, "You look like you haven't eaten since Missouri." "Kansas," Clara said. "Actually." Something shifted in Martha's face. Not quite a smile, more like the beginning of a decision. "Well," Martha said, "come inside then. Food's still warm." She ate at the kitchen table while Wyatt was out seeing to the horse, and Martha moved around her with the efficiency of someone who had spent decades in kitchens and knew exactly how to be present without being intrusive. Clara ate more than she'd intended. She hadn't realized how hungry she was, had been suppressing it the way she'd been suppressing everything else, keeping herself running on the force of will and forward motion. Now that she'd stopped moving, everything came flooding back in. Hunger, cold, exhaustion so deep it had settled into her joints. "Thomas spoke about you a great deal," Martha said, refilling her water glass without being asked. "I'm starting to understand that," Clara said. "How was proud of you." Martha set the pitcher down and leaned against the counter. Arms crossed, not defensively, just comfortably. the posture of a woman who had no particular anxiety about the space she occupied. Said you were the smartest person in your family, and also the most stubborn, and that those two things made life considerably harder for you than they should have. Clara stared at her plate. He wasn't wrong. No, Martha agreed. He generally wasn't. A pause. He also said that when you got here you'd spend the first week trying to figure out how to leave. Clara looked up. Martha met her gaze steadily. So I'm telling you now before you start planning, she said. This house has enough rooms, the work here is real, and the people doing it are decent. Nobody in this valley knows your name from Adam, and nobody's going to care about whatever happened in Boston once they see you're willing to work. She tilted her head slightly. You are willing to work? Yes, Clara said immediately. Then that's the only qualification that matters out here. Wyatt came in from outside, pulling off his jacket, hanging his hat on the hook by the door, with the automatic precision of habit. He looked at Clara, then at the plate in front of her, and the briefest expression of relief crossed his face so quick she almost missed it. You should sleep, he said. Martha'll show you your room. I need to... She stopped. She'd been about to say, I need to make some kind of plan, but she looked at the two of them standing there in that kitchen. This man who had waited at a train depot for weeks to meet a dead friend's sister, and this woman who had kept supper warm for a stranger, and the sentence ran out of ground. Sleep, Wyatt said again, gently. Final. She slept. She woke before dawn. For a long, confused moment, she didn't know where she was. The ceiling was wrong. The sounds were wrong. Too much wind, too much quiet, not enough city. And then it came back to her in pieces. The train. The depot. Your brother passed 2 months ago. Wyatt's voice in the dark. You're safe now. She lay still in the unfamiliar bed and waited for the panic to arrive. The spinning, breathless kind that had been waking her up in the middle of the night for 6 months. The kind that said, you have nothing. You are nothing. And everything you had is gone. It didn't come. What came instead was something quieter and harder to name. A kind of stillness. Not contentment. Not relief. More like the feeling after a storm passes and you step outside and the air is sharp and washed clean and everything that's broken is still broken, but at least the wind has stopped for a minute. She could think. She hadn't been able to think clearly in weeks. She sat up and looked at the window at the pre-dawn gray just beginning to lighten the edges of the curtains. She thought Thomas knew I was coming. He made arrangements. He asked someone to look for me. She thought, he left me something. Not just a room. He left me a reputation. His reputation, the trust people had for him in this valley. That's not nothing. She thought I need to find out what else he left. Because Thomas had not been a man who did things halfway. If he had written to her saying, come, you'll have a home. Then there was more than a guest room at a stranger's ranch involved. Thomas had been methodical. Thomas had been thorough. Thomas had been, as their father used to say, with an exasperation that was at least 60% admiration, irritatingly prepared for every contingency. What had he been prepared for this time? She got up, dressed quietly, and went looking for an answer. Jate. She found Wyatt in the barn. He was already working. She could hear it before she got there. The low sounds of someone moving through morning chores with practiced quiet. When she pushed the barn door open, he looked up from where he was forking hay, and he didn't ask what she was doing up or why she was there. He just looked at her for a moment, reading something in her face. Couldn't sleep, he said. I slept, she said. I need to ask you something. He set down the fork and turned toward her. All right. Did Thomas leave anything behind? Documents, papers, legal papers? Something moved in Wyatt's expression, quick, careful. What makes you ask? Because I knew my brother, Clara said. And he didn't write to me and tell me to come all this way just so I could sleep in a guest room on someone else's charity. He had a plan. He always had a plan. She watched Wyatt's face. You know something. About what he left. Wyatt was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone who didn't know, the quieter of someone deciding how much to say and when. Yes, he said finally. Tell me. He studied her for a long moment. This woman who had arrived on his doorstep 12 hours ago with a crumpled letter and empty pockets, and apparently the instincts of a woman who had been underestimated by too many people for too long and was done letting it happen. Then he said, "Thomas owned land, Miss Whitmore. Not just the house, land. A tract in Whitmore Valley, that's what the locals call it, named for him. Good land, valuable land." He paused. "Land that someone in this town has been trying to get his hands on for 2 years. Clara held very still. "Who?" she said. Wyatt looked at her steadily. "Man named Victor Hale," he said. "Richest man in Silver Creek. Maybe the most powerful man in this part of Colorado." Another pause. "And he's going to find out you're here by morning, which means by tomorrow he's going to come calling." Clara stood in the door of the barn with the cold morning air at her back and the smell of hay and horses around her, and she thought about a man in a Boston courthouse speaking the words not credible in a calm, measured tone. She thought about 6 months of proving over and over again that power could simply decide what was true and make it stick. She thought about Thomas writing his letters, making his arrangements, asking Wyatt to watch for her at the train. He knew, she thought. He knew exactly what was coming. "Then I suppose," she said quietly, "I should know what I'm walking into before he gets here." And in Wyatt Callahan's expression for the first time, something that looked very much like the beginning of respect. She had arrived with nothing. A worn-out suitcase, a dead brother's letter, a handful of coins, and somewhere beneath a valley she hadn't even seen yet, a piece of land that a powerful man believed he had already won. She didn't know that yet, but she was about to find out. And the woman who walked through that barn door that morning was not quite the same woman who had stepped off the train the night before. Something had shifted. Something had decided. Clara Whitmore had come to Colorado looking for somewhere to disappear. Instead, she'd stumbled into the middle of a fight. And the most dangerous thing about Clara Whitmore, the thing that man in the Boston courthouse had never understood, was that when she had nowhere left to run, she stopped running entirely. She turned around. And she didn't blink. Wyatt told her everything before the sun was fully up, not because he'd planned to, but because Clara Whitmore stood in that barn with her arms folded and her chin level and her eyes doing that thing, that steady, unflinching thing that made it clear she was not going to be managed, softened, or protected from the truth. He'd seen that look before, actually. On Thomas. The siblings had it in common, that particular brand of stillness that wasn't patience so much as the refusal to be rushed. So he told her. Victor Hale had been after the Whitmore land for 2 years. Started with an offer generous on the surface, the kind of number that sounds like kindness, until you realize what the land is actually worth. Thomas had turned it down flat. Then the offers got less generous, and the pressure got less subtle. And somewhere in the last year of his life, Thomas Whitmore had quietly begun preparing for a fight he knew he wasn't going to be around to finish. He kept records, Wyatt said. Everything. Every conversation, every letter, every time Hale or one of his men said something that crossed a line. He kept it all. He looked at her carefully. He told me where it was. The ledger, the deed documents, all of it. He said to give it to you when you arrived. Said you'd know what to do with it. Clara was quiet for a long moment. "He was more confident in me than I am," she said. "That was Thomas," Wyatt said. "He generally was." She looked at him. "Where is it?" "The house," he said. "The Whitmore house. Your brother's house. It's still standing. Nobody's moved in, nobody's touched it. Hale tried to claim it was abandoned, but the county recorder knows better." He paused. "It's yours, Miss Whitmore. The house and the land both. Legally, without question. The only issue is whether you can hold on to it once Hale decides to make things difficult." "And he will," she said. It wasn't a question. "He already is," Wyatt said. "Word travels fast in a town this size. By now he knows the afternoon train came in yesterday. He'll be asking questions by breakfast." She nodded slowly, processing this. Something in her expression was doing the kind of quiet, rapid calculation that reminded Wyatt of a chess player not panicking, just mapping. "Take me to the house," she said. Now. Now. He looked at her. This woman who had arrived 12 hours ago half-frozen and hollow-eyed, who had eaten one plate of Martha's food and slept maybe 4 hours and was now standing in his barn at first light, asking to ride out to a property that a powerful and ruthless man had been trying to take for 2 years. "All right," he said, and went to saddle the horse. Martha caught them on the way out. She appeared in the doorway of the ranch house with her arms crossed and her expression set in the particular configuration that meant she had something to say and was going to say it regardless of timing. "She needs a proper coat first," Martha announced. "Martha," Wyatt started. "I'm not asking," Martha said. She disappeared back inside and returned 40 seconds later with a heavy wool coat that she held out to Clara without ceremony. "It was Thomas's. It'll be too big. Wear it anyway." Clara took the coat. She held it for a moment, just a moment, and then she put it on. It was too big. The shoulders dropped, the sleeves were long. She didn't say anything about that. She just buttoned it up and straightened her spine inside it, as if she were borrowing something more than wool. "Thank you," she said quietly. Martha looked at her for a moment with those sharp, steady eyes. "Don't thank me yet," she said. "Get through the next week first." They rode out into the gray early morning, and Clara didn't look back. The Whitmore house was 4 miles from the Callahan ranch, set back from the road on a rise that gave it a view of the valley below a wide-open stretch of land that Wyatt had always thought was some of the finest in Colorado. Though he'd never said so to Thomas, because Thomas would have agreed too enthusiastically, and Wyatt had a natural suspicion of enthusiasm. He watched Clara see it, watched her take in the house. Modest, well-built, solid, and then the land beyond it, and whatever was happening in her face, he looked away from it, because it was the kind of private thing a person shouldn't have an audience for. The moment of understanding that something was yours. That someone had been thinking of you, building toward you, holding space for you even when you didn't know it. He let her have that moment alone. Then she said, "Show me inside." The house was cold and still. Nobody had been in it for 2 months. But it was clean and it was intact, and the moment Clara stepped through the door, something happened to the set of her shoulders. A very subtle thing. As if the house recognized her, or she recognized it, though she'd never been there before. She moved through the rooms without speaking. Wyatt followed at a distance. He watched her stop at the small desk in the back room, Thomas's study. Really, though, it wasn't much bigger than a closet, and run her hands along the surface, as if reading something by touch. "Where?" she said. Wyatt crossed the room, reached beneath the desk, and felt for the catch Thomas had shown him. A small panel gave way. Behind it was a flat metal box. He set it on the desk. Clara opened it. Inside was everything Thomas had promised. The original land deed signed and witnessed and registered properly in the county records. No ambiguity, no loophole, no question of ownership. Below that, a stack of folded papers held together with a piece of cord. Thomas's records of every interaction with Victor Hale, dated and detailed in Thomas's precise handwriting. Letters. Copies of correspondence. Notes of conversations written down immediately after they happened. The kind of documentation that a man creates when he knows that his version of events may one day need to stand up under scrutiny. And beneath all of it, a letter addressed in Thomas's hand to Clara whenever she comes. She picked it up. Her hands were steady. She turned it over once, looking at her own name, and then she pressed it flat against the front of Thomas's coat and did not open it. Not yet. Wyatt understood. He stepped back toward the door. "I'll wait outside," he said. "Stay," she said. Not a request exactly. More like she'd discovered in the last hour that she didn't want to be alone quite as much as she'd thought. He stayed. She opened the letter. He didn't read it with her. He faced the window and looked at the valley while she read, giving her whatever privacy that half-measure could offer. He heard no sound from her for a long moment, just the faint rustle of the paper, and then silence. Then she said, "He knew he was dying." "Yes," Wyatt said. "He knew for months. He didn't tell me in his letters." "He didn't want you to come out of grief," Wyatt said. "He wanted you to come because you were ready." Another silence. He could hear her breathing slow, deliberate, the kind of breathing a person does when they are managing something large. "He says in this letter," she said, and her voice had changed slightly quieter, more careful, That Victor Hale will try to claim the land using a legal argument about residency. That because Thomas was ill and the land was unworked, Hale can argue it was effectively abandoned. She paused. He says the only way to counter that argument is for the rightful heir to be present actively claiming the land within a reasonable time frame. That's right, Wyatt said. He turned from the window now. Thomas told me the same thing. That's why he kept writing to you. That's why he needed you to come. Clara looked at him. He didn't just invite me here to start over, she said slowly. No, Wyatt said. He needed me here, specifically, legally. He needed his heir to show up and stand her ground, Wyatt said. Yes. She looked down at the letter in her hands for a long moment. Something was moving across her face that he couldn't entirely read, not anger, not betrayal, more complicated than either. The feeling of finding out that someone who loved you was also at the very end relying on you, and not being sure how to hold both of those things at once. He could have just told me that, she said quietly. He could have just written and said, Clara, I'm dying, and I need you to come save the land. Would you have come? Wyatt asked. She opened her mouth, closed it. That's what I thought, he said gently. She looked at the letter for another moment. Then she folded it carefully, tucked it inside the coat, Thomas's coat, her coat now, and stood up straight. I need to understand what I'm dealing with, she said. Tell me about Victor Hale, everything. So he told her that too. Victor Hale had come to Silver Creek 12 years ago with money from somewhere back east that nobody asked too hard about, and he had spent those 12 years accumulating land and influence the way some men accumulate it by being smarter than most people, harder than most people, and completely willing to operate in the gray space between what was legal and what was ethical. He owned the largest ranch in the county, the only bank in Silver Creek, and half the businesses on Main Street, either directly or through arrangements that left their owners technically independent and practically not. I wasn't violent. That was important to understand. He didn't need to be. He was the kind of powerful that worked through paperwork and patience, through lawyers and lenders, and the slow grinding weight of institutional pressure. He'd ruined men who'd crossed him without ever raising his voice. The frontier, Wyatt explained, had a reputation for being lawless, but the truth was more complicated out here. The law was simply young, and young, law had gaps, and men like Victor Hale were very good at finding gaps. The Whitmore land, Wyatt continued, sits on the only real water source on the south side of the valley. If Hale controls that land, he controls access to water for about a dozen other ranches, including mine. He said that last part evenly without emphasis, but Clara caught it. You have a stake in this, she said. Every rancher in this valley has a stake in this, Wyatt said. Thomas knew that, part of why he held on so long. She looked at him for a long moment. Is that why you met me at the depot, because of the water rights? He held her gaze directly. I met you at the depot, because Thomas was my friend, and he asked me to, he said. The water rights are why I'll help you fight. It wasn't the most romantic answer in the world, but Clara Whitmore had had enough of romantic answers from men who turned out to mean something different than what they said. An honest answer, even a complicated one, was worth more to her than a pretty one. All right, she said. Then we understand each other. We do, he said. She looked around the room one more time. The desk, the papers, the metal box, the house that smelled like absence and cold, and very faintly like the particular cedar soap Thomas had apparently favored. I'm moving in, she said. Today. Right now. Wyatt blinked. It's cold in here. No fire's been lit in 2 months. I know, she said. Help me light one. He looked at her for a moment with something that was definitely not amusement, but shared that neighborhood. Yes, ma'am, he said, and went to find the kindling. They had the main room warm within the hour. Martha, who had apparently anticipated this development, arrived mid-morning with a wagon carrying food blankets and a second coat of her own that she insisted was too small for her now and would have just been sitting anyway. She also brought, for reasons she did not explain, a ledger book and a set of pens. For keeping accounts, she said, setting them on Thomas's desk with the air of someone who has already decided that a battle is going to be won through organization. Your brother's records are a good start, but you'll need your own. Clara looked at the ledger, then at Martha. "You think I'm staying," she said. "I think you're fighting," Martha said. "Those are different things, but they'll do for now." That afternoon, a rider came from town. Clara heard the hoofbeats from inside the house. She was at the desk going through Thomas's papers, methodically reading every note, every date, every name, building in her head a picture of what had been happening in this valley while she was on the other side of the country, being publicly disgraced for things she didn't do. Wyatt was outside. She heard his voice low even, and another voice she didn't recognize higher with a tone that struck her immediately as the tone of someone delivering a message they are secretly enjoying. She came to the door. The rider was young 20 maybe, with an expression of studied indifference that didn't quite conceal his curiosity about her. He had a letter in his hand that he'd apparently just given to Wyatt, who was holding it with the particular care of a man who knows it contains something unpleasant. "For Miss Whitmore," the young man said, nodding at her. "From Mr. Hale." "I see," Clara said. "Thank you." She came down the porch steps and held out her hand for the letter. Wyatt hesitated just briefly, barely visible, and then gave it to her. She opened it while the rider watched, which she suspected was intentional. Victor Hale, based on what Wyatt had told her, was the kind of man who sent messages designed to be witnessed. The letter was beautifully written. Gracious even. It expressed sympathy for her loss, welcomed her to Silver Creek, wished her well in what must be an extremely difficult time, and then in the fourth paragraph explained with great regret that there were some legal questions surrounding the status of the Whitmore land that Mr. Hale felt compelled in good conscience to bring to her attention at the earliest opportunity. He would be honored if Miss Whitmore would agree to meet with him at her earliest convenience, so that he might help her understand the situation fully, and perhaps together they might arrive at an arrangement that was fair to all parties. She read it twice. Then she folded it calmly and looked at the young rider. "Please tell Mr. Hale," she said pleasantly, "that I received his letter and I appreciate his concern. And please tell him that I am in fact fully aware of the legal status of my brother's land, which is, as the county records clearly show, my land, and that I look forward to any conversation he'd like to have about it, at my convenience." The young man's expression flickered surprise, quickly controlled. "I'll tell him," he said. "Thank you," Clara said, as if she were dismissing someone from a drawing room in Boston. "Good afternoon." The rider left. Wyatt waited until the hoofbeats faded down the road. Then he said, "He's not going to like that." "I know," Clara said. "He's going to come here himself, probably tomorrow." "I know that too." "Are you ready for that?" She looked down at the letter in her hand, the beautiful, gracious, predatory letter, and she thought about what it had cost Victor Hale to write something like that. All that careful language, all that cultivated reasonableness, sitting on top of something that was at its core simply someone deciding that what was yours should be his. She had read that letter before. Not this one specifically, but this letter. She'd read it in a courthouse hallway, spoken aloud in measured professional tones, by a lawyer who had built an entire argument on the premise that her account of events was simply not credible. The shape of the thing was the same. The power was the same. The assumption that she could be managed, outmaneuvered, worn down was absolutely the same, and she had survived that. Barely, and at great cost, but she had survived it. "Ask me something harder," she said. She went back inside and returned to Thomas's papers. She was there until well past dark. Martha had gone home with the wagon. Wyatt had offered to stay. She'd turned him down firmly, but without offense, because she needed to be alone with her brother's handwriting. Alone with his thinking, alone, with the evidence of a man who had spent his last months building her a foundation, even while he was dying. She needed to absorb that privately at her own pace, without anyone watching her face while she did it. She read everything. By the time the candle had burned halfway down, she had a clear picture. Thomas had been meticulous. The land deed was airtight. The records of Hale's pressure campaign were damning, not enough on their own to bring a legal action against him, but enough to demonstrate a pattern. Enough to show any reasonable person what had been happening. The legal argument. Hale would use the abandonment claim rested on one thing, that the land had been unworked and unoccupied since Thomas's death. 2 months of emptiness. That was his lever. But Clara was here now. She was here, and she was the legal heir, and she was sitting in this house at this desk intending to stay. The lever broke the moment she walked through the door. Hale knew that. That was why the letter had arrived the same day she had. That was why the language had been so carefully gracious. He was trying to negotiate before she understood her own position. The question was not whether she had the right to this land. She did, without question. The question was whether she had the will to hold it against a man who had made an art form of making people give up what was rightfully theirs. She sat back in Thomas's chair and looked at the ceiling and had a conversation with herself that was so old and so familiar it had the quality of scar tissue. The argument she'd been having with herself since the night everything fell apart in Boston. You don't have the resources for this. You don't have money for lawyers. You don't have connections in this town. You're a woman alone in a territory that doesn't know you, trying to hold off the most powerful man in the county. And then the other voice, the quieter one, the one that had been getting stronger. You survived worse than this. You survived being publicly destroyed by someone with more power than you, and you're still standing. You survived 6 months of everyone you knew deciding you weren't worth defending, and you got on a train anyway, and you came here anyway. What does Victor Hale have that you haven't already faced? She sat with that for a while. Then she picked up the new ledger Martha had brought, opened it to the first page, and began to write. She wrote down everything she'd read in Thomas's records, organized by date and category. She wrote down her own arrival date, her own name, the fact of her legal inheritance. She wrote down Hale's letter word by word from memory, because she had always had a memory for words. It was one of the things that had made her account in Boston so precise and so easily dismissed, because what woman, they'd implied, remembers things that carefully, unless she's constructing a story? She had always remembered things that carefully. She was done apologizing for it. She wrote until the candle was too low to be safe, then banked the fire and went to bed. She slept this time without the near panic of a woman who has nowhere to be. She slept like someone who has found her ground and is choosing to hold it. Victor Hale arrived the next morning at 9 o'clock, which she had to admit was punctual. She heard his horses plural, she realized, from inside the house. She took her time putting down her pen, straightening the papers on the desk, standing up and smoothing the front of her dress. She was wearing Thomas's coat again. She realized she'd put it on without thinking first thing this morning, and she decided to keep it on because she felt like that was the kind of thing Thomas would have appreciated. She opened the door before Hale could knock. It was not what she'd expected, which she suspected was intentional. Victor Hale was perhaps 55 with silver hair and a well-cut coat, and the kind of face that had been handsome once and was now simply authoritative. A face that had learned over decades to project absolute confidence in a way that felt almost impersonal. He was flanked by 2 men whose function was obvious, though they were standing back far enough to be plausibly deniable as mere employees. He smiled at her. It was a good smile. She gave him that. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Victor Hale, it's a genuine pleasure to meet you." "Mr. Hale," she said pleasantly, "won't you come in?" It wasn't quite an invitation, and wasn't quite not one. She stepped back from the door, and he came up the porch steps, his 2 men staying outside, she noted, and into the house. He looked around the room with the eyes of a man who has looked at this room in his imagination many times. She watched him do it. "I was fond of your brother," he said. "So I've heard," she said. "Would you like coffee?" "I'm afraid I've only just gotten the kitchen in order." "That's quite all right." He turned to look at her. "I won't take much of your time. I imagine you have a great deal to manage." "I do," she agreed, sitting down at Thomas's desk without being asked, which put her behind it, and him standing in front of it, which was a small thing, but not accidental. "But I always have time for my neighbors." Something moved in his expression, a recalibration. He'd been expecting something else. A grieving woman, maybe. An overwhelmed woman. A woman who would offer him tea with shaking hands and be grateful when he offered to make things simpler. "Your brother's estate," he said, settling into the chair across from the desk, as if the shift in power hadn't registered, "is more complicated than it may appear at first." "Is it?" Clara said. "There are questions about the land specifically. about its legal status given the period of non-occupancy since Thomas's passing. He leaned forward slightly, his elbows on his knees projecting reasonableness. I've been consulting with my own attorneys, and I believe there may be grounds for a challenge. Mr. Hale, Clara said. He stopped. She looked at him across the desk, with the same level direct expression she'd been practicing in one form or another for 32 years. I've read the deed, she said. I've read the county records. I've read my brother's documentation of the last 2 years of his life in significant detail. She held his gaze. I also received your letter yesterday, which I found very graciously worded. I want you to know I understood it completely. A silence. Hale looked at her. Really looked for the first time, the way people look when they realize they've been underestimating someone. She'd seen that look before too. It was one of her favorites. You're not what I expected, he said at last. No, she agreed. I rarely am. I hope you understand, he said. And the geniality was still there, but something underneath it had sharpened. That I have significant resources available for legal action if necessary. A prolonged dispute over this land would be expensive, stressful, for a woman in your position. What position is that? She asked, her voice perfectly calm. New to this territory, without legal representation, without... He paused delicately, established connections in this community. She let that land. Let him think it had hit something. Then she said, Mr. Hale, I'd like to show you something. She picked up Thomas's ledger, the original one, the records of 2 years of pressure and manipulation, and set it on the desk facing him. This is my brother's account, she said, of every conversation, every letter, every offer, and every refusal over the past 2 years. Dated. Witnessed in several cases. She watched his face carefully. It's a very thorough document. My brother was a thorough man. Hale looked at the ledger. His expression didn't change, but his hands resting on his knees went very still, threatening a legal dispute with a woman who just inherited her dead brother's land. Clara continued quietly and pleasantly. Looks one way in a courthouse, threatening a legal dispute after 2 years of documented pressure on that same deceased man that looks considerably different. She let the silence sit. Hale leaned back in his chair. He looked at her for a long moment, with an expression that she would come to recognize over the coming weeks as the one he wore when he was being genuinely thoughtful, when he had encountered something that didn't fit his existing map and was revising the map. You're Thomas's sister, all right, he said finally. His tone had changed, not friendlier, but more honest, more real. I am, she said. He stood up. He smoothed the front of his coat. He picked up his hat. We'll see how things stand, he said. Yes, Clara said. We will. She showed him to the door. She stood on the porch and watched him walk to his horse. At the gate, he turned back just once and looked at her, this woman standing in her dead brother's coat in front of her dead brother's house, with an expression that had just at the edges something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of calculation. She held his gaze until he turned away. Then she went back inside, sat down at Thomas's desk, and her hands shook for approximately 30 seconds before she made them stop. She wasn't afraid of Victor Hale, but she was not stupid enough to think that had been anything other than the opening move. The game had started, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was playing it on ground that was hers. She picked up her pen and kept writing. Wyatt arrived an hour later. He didn't ask how it had gone. He looked at her face and at the desk and at the ledger open in front of her and simply said, "He came then." He came, she confirmed. And, she told him. He listened without interrupting, which she was finding was simply how he did everything. Complete attention, no rush, no attempt to redirect or diminish or explain what she'd experienced in terms of his own experience. When she finished, he said, "He'll come back. I know. With lawyers next time. Or something worse." "I know that too." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. He looked at her across the room with those steady dark eyes that had. She was discovering the quality of good water, clear and deep, and you couldn't see the bottom of them. "What do you need?" he said. Nobody had asked her that. Not the question itself, simple, direct, no assumptions about what the answer should be in a very long time. She thought about it seriously. I need people in this town to know I'm here, she said. Specifically, that I've taken occupancy, that I intend to work this land, that I'm not going anywhere. She paused. If Victor Hale's argument rests on abandonment, then the answer is presence, visible, active public presence. Wyatt nodded slowly. That can be arranged. I also need to understand this land, she said, what it needs, what it can produce. I don't know anything about ranching or farming, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise, but I can learn. I can teach you, he said, and I need... She stopped. What? She looked at him for a moment. This man who had waited for her at a depot for weeks, who had told her hard truths before she'd known she needed them, who had asked, what do you need, and meant it without any apparent agenda attached. I need someone who's going to tell me when I'm wrong, she said. Not manage me, not protect me from things I can handle. Tell me when I'm making a mistake, and trust that I can hear it. He held her gaze. I can do that, he said. Good, she said. Then we have an arrangement. She turned back to the ledger. A moment later, she heard him pull out the other chair at the table, not the desk chair, the simple wooden chair against the wall, and sit down. And after a moment, she heard the scratch of his own pen on paper, because Wyatt Callahan apparently also kept records, and they worked together in comfortable silence for the better part of the afternoon. Outside, the valley spread wide and cold under a high winter sky. The land that a powerful man wanted and a dead man had loved, and a living woman had decided somewhere between a Boston courthouse and a Colorado barn to fight for. The first day was over. The real work was just beginning. Victor Hale did not come back with lawyers. He came back with a sheriff. It was 11 days after their first meeting. 11 days during which Clara had done exactly what she'd told Wyatt she was going to do, made herself visible, made herself present, made herself impossible to ignore. She had introduced herself to every rancher and shopkeeper within riding distance. She had gone to the county recorder's office in Silver Creek and sat across from a nervous young clerk named Douglas and walked him through the deed documentation line by line until he had signed and stamped a confirmation of her ownership with his own hand, and she had a copy in her keeping. She had started clearing the south field with help from two of Wyatt's ranch hands, men named Calhoun and Pete, who had shown up one morning without being asked and simply started working alongside her. And when she'd looked at Wyatt about it, he'd only shrugged and said, Thomas had been good to their families once upon a time. 11 days of work. 11 days of cold mornings and ink-stained fingers and muscles she hadn't known she had, making themselves known in the evenings. 11 days of learning the land, its water, its soil, its particular way of rewarding attention and punishing carelessness from Wyatt, who taught the way he did everything else directly without condescension, trusting her to absorb what she was told. And 11 days of nothing from Victor Hale, which Clara had known with the instinct of someone who had watched powerful men operate, meant he was not doing nothing. He was doing something she couldn't see yet. She found out what it was when the sheriff knocked on her door. His name was Cal Briggs. He was perhaps 50, with the look of a man who had been reasonable once and had let his reasonableness be purchased gradually over many years until he wasn't entirely sure what was his anymore. He held his hat in his hands when she opened the door, which was a good sign. Men who kept their hats on when they came to your door had already decided the conversation was going one way. Miss Whitmore, he said. I'm sorry to trouble you. Sheriff Briggs, she said. She had learned his name 2 days ago from Martha, who had given her an education in Silver Creek's social architecture with the precision of a general briefing troops. Please come in. He came in. He sat. He accepted coffee with the relief of a man who needed something to hold. Behind him, through the window, Clara could see 2 deputies on horseback in the road. Not at the gate. In the road. Far enough to be deniable, close enough to make a point. I've received a complaint, Briggs said, turning his hat slowly in his hands. From Mr. Hale's office, regarding this property. What kind of complaint? She said. Her voice was perfectly even. She had practiced this, the evenness. It did not come naturally. It was a skill like penmanship, and she had worked at it until it was reliable. "The claim is that the land is being occupied unlawfully," Briggs said. He had the expression of a man reading from a script he did not entirely believe. "That the ownership status is disputed, and that pending legal resolution the current occupant should—" "Sheriff?" Clara said quietly. He stopped. She set down her coffee cup. She folded her hands on the desk. She looked at him with the full weight of her attention, and she said, "Do you want to see the deed?" A pause. Something moved in his face. "I don't. That is Mr. Hale's position, is that the deed itself may be—" "The deed," Clara said, "was recorded with the county on the 12th of March, 1884, in my brother Thomas Whitmore's name. It transferred to me as his sole living heir upon his death, which the county also has on record. I have visited the recorder's office personally. I have a stamped and signed confirmation of that transfer." She pulled the document from the stack on her desk and set it in front of him. "Would you like to read it? Douglas can confirm it if you'd like to ask him directly." Briggs looked at the document. He looked at it for a long time. "Mr. Hale's attorneys contend," he started. "Mr. Hale's attorneys can file a legal challenge in the proper court," Clara said pleasantly, "through the proper process. That is absolutely their right. But unless they have done so, and unless a court has issued an order regarding this property, there is no legal basis for asking me to leave my own home." She paused. "Is there, Sheriff?" The silence in the room was complete. Briggs set the document down slowly. He looked at it, then at her, then at his hat, and Clara watched the quiet internal reckoning of a man who had come here believing he was doing something uncomplicated and was now understanding that it was not uncomplicated at all. "No," he said finally. "There isn't." "Then I appreciate you stopping by," Clara said, standing. "And I hope you'll have a conversation with Mr. Hale's office about the proper procedures for legal challenges. I'd hate for anyone to make a procedural error that complicated things unnecessarily." She showed him to the door. She stood on the porch and watched him ride back down to where his deputies waited, watched the three of them exchange words she couldn't hear, watched Briggs shake his head once no, and then all three rode off back toward Silver Creek. She stood there until they were gone. Then she gripped the porch railing with both hands and let herself breathe for exactly 10 seconds before she let go. Wyatt appeared from around the side of the house. He'd been in the barn, she realized, or pretending to be. Close enough to hear, far enough to let her handle it. "Well," he said. "He left," she said. Something crossed Wyatt's face that was satisfaction, and something else, something warmer and more private, that he didn't quite conceal fast enough. "You handled that," he said, "not a question." "I handled it," she confirmed. "This time." She said that last part deliberately, because she was not a fool, and she knew what had just happened was not a defeat of Victor Hale. It was a speed bump. A man who owned the bank and half the town, and had been accumulating power for 12 years, was not going to be stopped by a woman presenting documentation to his paid sheriff. He was going to try something else. The question was what? She went back inside and sat at the desk and thought about that for a long time. The answer came not from thinking, but from Martha. Martha Bell arrived the following morning while Clara was in the middle of teaching herself to keep farm accounts, a skill she was discovering. She had a genuine aptitude for numbers, having always made more sense to her than most people expected, and she arrived in a state that Clara had never seen her in before. Not her usual iron composure. Something tighter than that. Something that looked on Martha's face like controlled alarm. She sat down at the kitchen table. "There's talk in town." Clara set down her pen. "What kind of talk?" "About you," Martha said. "About Boston." She held Clara's gaze steadily. "About why you left." The air in the room changed. Clara's hands, flat on the desk, went very still. "What specifically?" she said carefully. "Are they saying?" Martha was quiet for a moment. The quiet of someone choosing words with great care, not to soften a blow, but to make sure it was accurate. "That you were involved in a scandal," she said. "That you made accusations against a prominent man that were proven false. That you were the word being used is disgraced." Clara sat with that. She had known in some abstract way that Boston would follow her. Reputation traveled. That was one of its functions, really, to be a thing that traveled, that arrived ahead of you, that preceded you into rooms and closed doors before you could open them. She had known it would catch up eventually. She hadn't expected eventually to be 11 days. "Who's saying it?" she asked. "Multiple people," Martha said, which means it didn't start with the people saying it. "Hale," Clara said. Martha didn't answer. She didn't need to. Clara stood up from the desk. She walked to the window and looked out at the valley. Her valley, Thomas's valley, and felt the familiar cold weight of it. The particular helplessness of being defined by a story that someone else was telling in a voice louder than yours to an audience that had no particular reason to prefer your version. She had been here before. She turned around. "Did Thomas know about Boston?" she asked. "What they said about me?" "Yes," Martha said. "He told me himself about a year ago. He was angry about it, angrier than I'd ever seen him." "Did he tell you what he believed?" Martha looked at her steadily. "He believed you," she said simply. "He said so in plain language, and I never had reason to doubt him." "Do you believe me?" Clara said. "You don't know me. You've known me 11 days. Martha was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I believe that a woman who arrives with nothing moves into a cold house." Alone faces down, Victor Hale across a desk, outmaneuvers Cal Briggs, and spends every evening studying land management by candlelight. That woman is not what they're saying she is in town. She paused. People who are what they're accused of don't fight this hard for something this hard to fight for. They take the easier road. Clara looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me," Martha said briskly. "Think about what you're going to do about it. Because it's going to get worse before it gets better, and the more Hale feels cornered, the dirtier his methods are going to get." She was right. And she was right faster than either of them anticipated. 2 days later, the bank sent a letter. The Silver Creek Savings and Land Bank, which was Clara had since learned owned entirely by Victor Hale, notified her formally that a lien was being placed on the Whitmore property, citing an alleged unpaid debt of her brother's in the amount of $432. The letter was dense with legal language full of terms designed to obscure, rather than clarify and attach to it, was what purported to be a promissory note signed by Thomas Whitmore 18 months prior. Clara read it 3 times. Then she walked over to Callahan Ranch, which she now did without thinking, the 4-mile ride having become as natural as breathing, and handed the letter to Wyatt without a word. He read it. His jaw tightened, very slightly, barely visible, but she was learning to read him the way you learn to read weather. "Thomas didn't have a debt at that bank," he said. "I know," Clara said. "He explicitly told me he never borrowed from Hale. He said he'd rather lose the land than give that man that kind of leverage." "I know," Clara said again. "Then this note has been fabricated," she said, "or manipulated, or the signature is forged. I don't know which yet." She looked at him. "But I know Thomas's handwriting. I've been reading his letters and his records for 11 days. That signature—" She stopped, started again. "Something is wrong with that signature." Wyatt looked at her sharply. "Are you sure?" "I'm not sure of anything yet," she said. "But I need to look at it next to his real handwriting. And I need someone who can speak credibly to what they see." Wyatt thought for a moment. Then he said, "Judge Harding." "Who?" "Retired federal judge. Lives about 20 miles north in Millbrook. He's been out here 15 years. He came west for his health and stayed because he liked it. He has no connection to Hale, no debt to him, no reason to favor him." He paused. "He was also a close friend of Thomas's. They played chess together every Sunday for the last 3 years." Clara stared at him. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that there's a retired federal judge 20 miles from here who knew my brother and has no ties to Victor Hale." "I'm telling you that Thomas had friends in interesting places," Wyatt said. "He generally did." She thought about that. About Thomas, methodical. Thomas, thorough. Thomas building his network quietly over 3 years in a way that only became visible when you needed it. She thought about a man who had known he was sick and known what was coming and spent his last year not just keeping records and preparing documents, but apparently also cultivating relationships. He was preparing for exactly this, she thought. He was preparing a defense, and he never got to use it. So he left it for me. "Take me to Judge Harding. she said. They rode north the following morning, Clara and Wyatt, into country that got more dramatic the further north you went, the mountains closer and more present. She was getting better on horseback, not good, not yet, but better, which she counted as evidence of something, though she wasn't entirely sure what. They didn't talk much on the ride. They had developed a comfortable rhythm in these past 11 days that she hadn't experienced with many people in her life. Not the silence of people with nothing to say, but the silence of people with enough to say that they didn't feel compelled to fill every pause with it. Judge Harding opened the door himself. He was perhaps 70, small and compact, with the bright eyes of a man whose mind had never slowed down to match the pace of his body. He took one look at Clara, and his expression did something complicated. "You're Thomas's sister," he said. "I am," she said. "Clara, I can see it," he said. Come in, come in." He stood back from the door. "I wondered when you'd get here. Thomas said you were coming. Kept saying it right up until—" He stopped. His voice changed. "He talked about you a great deal, Miss Whitmore. He was very proud of you." She pressed her lips together. "Thank you, sir." They sat in his study, a room overflowing with books, the kind of room that announces its owner's mind before he opens his mouth, and she laid out the bank's letter and the alleged promissory note on his desk. She laid beside it 3 samples of Thomas's actual handwriting from the records in the metal box. Harding put on his glasses. He bent over the documents. He was quiet for a long time. Clara watched his face. She watched the moment he saw it. The thing she had seen. The thing she couldn't articulate precisely, but that had struck her the way a wrong note strikes someone with musical training. A wrongness. A performance of a signature rather than a signature itself. Harding said. A small sound. Freighted. "Judge," Wyatt started. "Give me a moment," Harding said. More silence. He picked up each document in turn, held them close, set them down. He took off his glasses, cleaned them, put them back on, looked again. Then he said, "The signature on this promissory note is not Thomas Whitmore's signature." The words landed in the room like stones in still water. Clara had known it. She had been almost certain. But hearing it said aloud by a retired federal judge who had known Thomas for 3 years and had no reason to lie was an entirely different thing. "You're certain," she said. "In a court of law," Harding said, straightening and looking at her directly. "I would testify to this without hesitation. The letter formation is wrong. The pressure is wrong. The natural rhythm of a man's handwriting, the way a pen moves when it's automatic, when it's habitual. That's not something that's easy to fake, and this was not faked well." His voice had shifted. It had the quality now of a judge addressing a court, precise and weighted. "Someone signed Thomas Whitmore's name on this document. It was not Thomas Whitmore." Wyatt was very still beside her. Clara looked at the document on the desk, at the forged signature, at Victor Hale's name in the letterhead of the bank above it. "He forged it," she said. Not a question. Not even really directed at anyone. Just the fact of it settling. "Someone did," Harding said carefully. "I can speak to the signature. Attribution is a separate matter. But the signature is false. Without question." She sat back in her chair and took one slow, careful breath. Victor Hale had forged her dead brother's signature on a bank document in order to place a fraudulent lien on her land. He had been so confident she would fold, so certain she was exactly what he expected, a grieving woman without resources or connections, easy to outmaneuver, that he had done this. He had committed fraud, and he had no idea that Thomas Whitmore had spent 3 years building a chess friendship with a retired federal judge 20 miles north. "Judge Harding," she said when she trusted her voice again, "would you be willing to put what you've just told us in writing?" He looked at her for a long moment over his glasses. "Miss Whitmore," he said, and something in his voice carried not just respect, but something older and deeper. The feeling of a man who has spent decades watching justice fail and is being offered unexpectedly a chance to do something about it. "I would be honored to." She rode back to Silver Creek with a signed affidavit from a retired federal judge in her saddlebag and the knowledge that the game had just changed completely. But the road home took them through the edge of town. And as they rode down Main Street, something was wrong. She felt it before she understood it, a shift in the quality of the attention they were receiving. People on the street looking and then looking away. Two women who had nodded at her pleasantly just last week turned their faces toward a shop window as she passed. She kept her expression neutral. Beside her, Wyatt said nothing, but she felt his posture change slightly, a subtle tightening the way a person braces. They were almost through town when a man stepped off the boardwalk directly into their path. Middle-aged, heavy through the shoulders, with an expression that had gone mean and decided. "Whitmore woman," he said, looking up at her on horseback with his arms crossed. She stopped the horse. "Yes," she said. "Heard about you," he said. "Heard what you did back east." The street had gone quiet in the particular way that streets go quiet when they sense a scene developing. Clara looked down at him. She was aware of everything, the people watching Wyatt beside her going very still. The weight of the affidavit in her bag, the cold air, her own heartbeat, and she made a choice in approximately 1 second. "I'm sure you have," she said clearly, so that anyone near enough to be listening could hear her. "Silver Creek is a small town and people talk. That's how towns work." The man blinked. He'd expected her to be flustered. "What I heard," he said, pressing forward, "is that you're exactly the kind of woman we don't need out here." "You heard wrong," she said, simply and without heat. "But I understand that sometimes people pass along what they're told, without asking where it came from or why." She looked at him steadily. "You might want to ask yourself before you say anything else, who benefits from you believing badly of me and repeating it in public." She let that sit for exactly 2 seconds. "Have a good afternoon." She nudged the horse forward. He stepped aside. She did not look back. Though she heard the murmur of voices behind her, the particular murmur that meant what she'd said had landed somewhere and people were turning it over. A block later, Wyatt said quietly, "That was well done." "I had practice," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were not. She kept them low on the reins where he couldn't see. They were a mile out of town before she said, "How bad is it?" Wyatt thought for a moment. She had come to recognize that pause. It meant he was deciding between what was comforting and what was true, and choosing truth. "Bad enough," he said. "Not fatal. But Hale's been working it, talking to people, letting things circulate." A pause. "The affidavit changes the game, but we need to move fast." "How fast?" "I think we go to Briggs first, directly. Show him the affidavit, explain what it means. Give him the chance to be on the right side of this before it gets ugly. And if he doesn't take that chance, then we go over his head." Clara rode in silence for a moment. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what Thomas wrote in his letter. He said the land matters, but that's not all that matters. He said—" She paused, remembering the careful handwriting, the words she had read so many times they'd become part of her. "He said the people in this valley are worth fighting for. Not just the water rights. The people who depend on the water. The families." "He was right about that," Wyatt said. "He also said something else." She looked at Wyatt, and something in her voice had shifted, had gotten quieter and more certain at the same time. "He said that the best thing I could do when I got here was stop thinking of myself as someone who had lost everything and start thinking of myself as someone who had something to give." Wyatt turned his head to look at her. "He said you'd resist that idea," Wyatt said slowly. "He knew me well," she said. "Are you still resisting it?" She thought about the man on the street, the women who had turned away, the forged signature on a document designed to take from her the last thing Thomas had tried to give her. She thought about Hale in her house looking around the room with his owner's eyes. She thought about a courthouse in Boston and a lawyer saying "not credible" in a measured tone. And then she thought about Douglas, the county clerk, nervously stamping her documentation with his own hand. About Calhoun and Pete showing up at first light to clear her Southfield. About Martha arriving with a wagon and a ledger and a spare coat and no apology for any of it. About Harding bending over the desk with his glasses on, looking at a forged signature, saying without question, "No," she said, "I'm not." They rode the rest of the way home, in the kind of silence that is not empty, but full of what has been decided, full of what is coming, full of two people who had started as strangers and had become in 11 days something she didn't have a precise word for yet. She went to see Briggs the next morning. Alone. Wyatt had offered to come. She had told him no, and when he'd started to argue, she had looked at him with the expression that was, she was discovering the one that ended arguments, and he had sat back down. She needed to do this alone. Not because she couldn't accept help. She was past that particular brand of stubbornness, but because what she was going to say to Cal Briggs needed to come from her in her voice without anyone standing behind her. The power of it depended on that. She sat across from Briggs in his office, which smelled of old coffee and something that might have been regret, and she set the affidavit on his desk and let him read it. She watched his face. She watched the moment he understood what it meant for the complaint he'd delivered at Hale's request, what it meant for his professional relationship with the most powerful man in the county. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice was very careful. "Judge Harding. He'll speak to it directly if asked." She paused. "He's 20 miles north. You know him, I assume." "I know of him," Briggs said. "Then you know his word is good." Briggs sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, which Clara interpreted as a man calculating rapidly and uncomfortably the various positions he was now occupying simultaneously and how much clearance he had in each direction. "This is a significant allegation," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "It is. Against a very significant man." "Yes," she said again. He looked at her. "You understand what you're asking me to do." "I'm not asking you to do anything yet," she said. "I'm showing you information that has come into my possession as a courtesy. Because I believe in doing things through proper channels. And because I think you're a man who, when it comes down to it, cares more about what's right than about what's easy." She said that last part. Not with flattery. She kept her voice dry and even, but with the particular tone of someone who is making an observation and leaving the space for it to land or not. Briggs looked at her for a long moment. "Thomas said you were something," he said. "You knew my brother." "Everybody knew Thomas," Briggs said quietly. He stopped. Something moved across his face. "He was a good man, and he deserved better than what Hale's been doing to his land and his memory." She waited. Briggs picked up the affidavit. He looked at it again. He set it down. "I'll need a few days," he said. "You have them," Clara said. "But not many." She stood. She shook his hand, which seemed to surprise him, and she walked out of his office into the cold morning air and stood on the boardwalk for a moment, letting the town move around her. A week ago, the women had turned away. This morning, 2 of them nodded at her as they passed. Small thing. And almost nothing. But Clara Whitmore had learned the hard way that almost nothings had a way of adding up. She walked back to the hitching post, untied her horse, and rode home to her valley. That afternoon, without planning it, she did something she hadn't done in years. She laughed. Calhoun had said something not even particularly funny. Just a dry observation about the stubbornness of the particular stretch of ground they were trying to clear, and something about it combined with everything else. The weight of the last weeks, and the absurdity of her own situation, and the strange and unasked-for discovery that she was still capable of finding things funny. All of it came together, and she laughed. A real laugh surprised out of her, ungainly and genuine. Calhoun grinned. Pete looked up from what he was doing. And from where he was working 20 feet away, Wyatt turned at the sound of it. He looked at her laughing, this woman who had arrived at his depot with nothing and had spent 2 weeks fighting for everything with a precision and a stubbornness that reminded him every single day of the man he'd lost. And something happened in his expression that he turned away before she could identify. She noticed anyway. She noticed, and she filed it away in the place where she kept things she wasn't ready to look at directly yet. There was enough to look at directly for now. Tomorrow Victor Hale was going to find out about the affidavit. Probably before evening. Information moved fast in Silver Creek, and Hale had ears everywhere. When he found out he was going to do something, she didn't know what. She had learned in her 2 weeks in this valley that Hale's methods were inventive and his patience was considerable, and that the one thing she could not afford was to feel safe just because the last move had gone her way. She stopped laughing. She picked up her tool and went back to work. The ground was harder than it looked, but it was hers. and she was learning slowly and surely, and with the particular certainty of a woman who has stopped running exactly how to work it. Hale found out about the affidavit on a Thursday. Clara knew he'd found out, because by Thursday evening, Pete rode in from town with news that Hale's lawyers had filed a formal legal challenge at the county courthouse, not the lien anymore, something broader and more aggressive. A full contest of the deed. The argument was complicated, layered with legal language that Pete couldn't fully reproduce, but the shape of it was clear. Hale was claiming that Thomas's deed itself had irregularities. That the original land transfer years back had procedural defects that made the whole chain of ownership questionable. He had abandoned the forged note strategy entirely, which told Clara everything she needed to know. The affidavit had scared him. Not destroyed him. A man like Hale didn't destroy easily, but scared him enough to change his entire approach to cut loose a gambit he'd clearly been confident in and pivot to something else. She sat with that information for exactly 10 minutes. Then she rode to find Wyatt. Hal was at the fence line on the east side of the Callahan property, working with Calhoun on a section that had come down in the last wind. He looked up when he heard her horse and read her face before she said a word. "How bad?" he said. "He's gone after the deed itself," she said. "Not the lien, the original deed." Wyatt set down the fence post he'd been holding. "That's a different fight. Bigger fight," she agreed. "Longer, more expensive. He knows I don't have money for a long legal battle." "No," Wyatt said. "But Judge Harding might know someone." She looked at him. "I can't keep calling in Thomas's favors." "Why not?" he said, and his voice had an edge she hadn't heard before, not impatient but firm. "Certain. Thomas built those relationships on purpose. You know that. He wasn't collecting friends, Clara. He was building something. A structure. The same way he kept records and wrote letters and prepared that box. He was building a system of support for exactly this situation, and you are not taking advantage of anyone by using it. You are completing what he started." She was quiet for a moment. Nobody had called her by her first name. Not out here, not in Silver Creek, not in the weeks she'd been in Colorado. It had always been Miss Whitmore, properly, carefully, with the full weight of distance and formality. And she hadn't minded it. She'd needed the distance, actually. The formality was armor. He'd used her name without thinking. She could tell he hadn't thought about it. It had come out the way things come out when the guard drops briefly and the real thing shows through. He realized it a half-second after she did. She watched the awareness cross his face. "I'm sorry," he said. "Miss Whitmore." "Don't," she said. "It's fine." A pause. "You're right. About Thomas's intent." She looked away toward the mountains. I've spent so long being someone who needed things that I can't always tell anymore when accepting help is wisdom and when it's weakness." "Those are different things," he said. "Knowing the difference is how you stop confusing them." She turned back to him. "And you think I know the difference now?" He looked at her steadily. "I think you've known the difference for a while," he said. "I think you just needed to be somewhere long enough to trust the knowing." She held his gaze for a moment. The wind came up between them, cold and smelling like pine and distance, and she made herself breathe through it. "All right," she said. "I'll write to Judge Harding tonight." She wrote the letter that evening. She sent it with Pete at first light. Harding's reply came back in 2 days. He knew a lawyer in Denver, a man named Aldrich, who had argued land cases before the Colorado Territorial Court, and who owed Harding a professional debt of the kind that rarely got repaid cleanly. Harding had already written to him. Aldrich would come. That was on a Monday. On Tuesday, 3 things happened. The first was that Douglas from the county recorder's office appeared at her door before 8 in the morning, nervous and sweating, despite the cold turning his hat in his hands the way Briggs had turned his. He'd ridden out alone. He had the look of a man who had made a difficult decision and was afraid it was going to cost him. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I need to tell you something." She stood back from the door. "Come in." He came in. He didn't sit. He stood in the middle of the room with his hat clenched in front of him, and he said in a voice that was trying hard to be steady, "I was approached, 2 days ago, by one of Mr. Hale's men." She said nothing. She waited. He said that if I were to find upon review that there was some irregularity in the recording of the Whitmore deed, a clerical error, something that would need to be corrected through a process that might take considerable time, that Mr. Hale would be very appreciative. He swallowed. He mentioned a specific sum, for my appreciation. Clara looked at him for a long moment. "What did you say?" she asked. "I said I'd think about it," Douglas said miserably. I know how that sounds. I have a family. I have—" He stopped. He pressed his lips together. "I didn't come here to do it. I came here because I'm not going to do it, and because I thought you should know." He met her eyes. "The deed is clean, Miss Whitmore. I've checked it 6 times. There is no irregularity. And I'm going to say that to anyone who asks, including in a court of law, and I'm going to put my statement in writing today." Clara stood very still. Then she said, "Are you afraid of what this will cost you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said honestly. "Then it means a great deal more that you came," she said. He nodded. He put his hat on. Then he stopped at the door and turned back. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "My wife's mother, she lives alone on a parcel about 12 miles east. She's been trying to learn letters for 2 years. Can't find anyone to teach her." He paused. "Thomas used to help her when he could get there. She misses it." He looked at her carefully. "I heard you have some education." She looked at him. "Send her to me," she said. He nodded once firmly, like a man who has made a trade he intends to honor, and left. The second thing that happened on Tuesday was that Hale's men, not Hale himself, his men came to the South Field. There were 3 of them. Clara was working with Calhoun when they rode up, and she saw Calhoun's hand go to his side reflexively before he controlled it. She put her hand on his arm, light brief, and he stood still. The men didn't threaten. They weren't that obvious. They rode slowly along the edge of the field, looking at the work she'd done, making no attempt to conceal their evaluation of it. One of them said something to another in a low voice, and both of them laughed. Then the third one, the oldest with a face like weathered leather, looked directly at Clara and said, "Lot of work for a woman who's not going to be here long." She looked back at him. "Good afternoon," she said pleasantly. He held her gaze, waiting for something flinching perhaps, or anger, either of which would have satisfied him. She gave him neither. She turned back to her work. They sat there for another 5 minutes. Then they rode away. Calhoun let out a long breath. "Sorry," he said. "I know," she said. "Don't apologize, but thank you for not." She kept working. Her hands were sure and steady. Her mind was not entirely, but she had learned by now that you didn't need a steady mind. You just needed steady hands and the willingness to keep moving. The third thing that happened on Tuesday was the one she hadn't seen coming. Martha came at evening. She had that look again, not alarm this time, something more complicated than alarm. The look of someone carrying news that is bad and good at the same time, and not sure how the person receiving it is going to hold both. She sat down at the kitchen table and she said, "There's going to be a town meeting, Friday evening. Hale has called it. Ostensibly to discuss water access for the coming season. Actually, to make the case against me in public," Clara said. "To make the case against you where everyone in the county can hear it," Martha said. "He's going to bring his lawyers. He's going to present the legal challenge as a matter of community concern. Frame it so that your holding the land looks like it's hurting everyone else." She paused. "He's very good at this. He's done it before. He did it to the Hennessy family 4 years ago, and they sold inside a month." Clara sat with this. A town meeting. Public. Everyone watching. She thought about the last time she'd been at the center of something public. A courthouse hallway in Boston. Her name spoken in careful, measured tones. Not credible. The particular humiliation of having your truth treated as a performance, your reality treated as a story, and not being able to do anything but stand there while it happened. She felt the old fear move through her. She didn't pretend it wasn't there. She had stopped pretending things weren't there. She just didn't let it make the decision. "Then I'll be there," she said. Martha looked at her. "Clara." "I'll be there," she said again. "And I'll speak." A long pause. He has lawyers, Martha said quietly. You'll be standing in front of the whole county. I know. They're going to say things about Boston. I know that too. And you're still going to go, Martha. Clara looked at her steadily. This woman who had been one of the first to extend a hand, who had shown up with a wagon and a spare coat, and no explanation beyond simple human decency. I spent 6 months in Boston being quiet, because I thought being quiet was dignified. Because I thought if I just didn't make a scene and didn't push back and waited for the truth to surface on its own, it would work out. She paused. It didn't work out. Martha said nothing. I am not going to be quiet anymore, Clara said. Not because I'm angry, though I am. Not because I want to fight, though I'm willing to. But because Thomas is dead, and he left this land to me, and people in this valley are going to have to decide what they believe, and the only way they can decide fairly is if they hear it from me. Directly. In my voice. Martha looked at her for a long moment. All right, she said finally. She stood up. She went to the door. Then she stopped and turned back, and on her face was an expression Clara had never seen there. Not the brisk practicality, not the steady evaluation, but something older and softer and fiercer all at once. You know what Thomas said to me? Martha said. The last week he was well enough to sit up. He said when my sister gets here, she's going to try to make herself small so she doesn't take up too much room. He said, don't let her. He said she's been taking up less space than she deserves for years, and it's time she stopped. Clara's throat tightened. He said that, she said. He said exactly that, Martha said, word for word. She opened the door. Friday evening, 7 o'clock, church hall. And then she was gone out into the dark, and Clara sat alone in Thomas's kitchen and let herself feel the full weight of what had just happened. Her brother, who was dead, was still looking out for her. She sat with that for a long time. Wednesday and Thursday she spent preparing. Not with lawyers, Aldrich hadn't arrived yet, and she wasn't going to wait on someone else's timing. She prepared the way she always prepared, the way that worked for her, by going through the facts until they were so clear in her mind that no question could dislodge them. Thomas's records. The deed. The affidavit. Douglas's statement, which he had delivered in writing as promised. Every date, every name, every number. She also did something else. She wrote out over those 2 days to every rancher in the valley that she hadn't yet spoken to directly. Not all of them came to the door. A few spoke to her through intermediaries. But most of them, enough of them, heard her out, heard the facts as she laid them plainly, and at least 4 of them, by the time Thursday evening was done, had said some version of the same thing. Thomas was good to us. Whatever we can do. She didn't ask them to do anything specifically. She just wanted them to know the shape of the situation from her before they heard Hale's version on Friday. Wyatt rode with her on those visits. He didn't do the talking. She did the talking, but he was there, and his presence meant something in this valley that she understood pragmatically and didn't resent. A woman's word was worth more in certain rooms when a man who was known and trusted was visible in the doorway behind her. That was a fact. An unjust fact, but a fact. She used it the way she used every tool available. Thursday night she sat alone at Thomas's desk and went over everything one more time. She was still sitting there when she heard hoofbeats late past 10, and then a knock at the door that was too firm to be casual. She opened it. Briggs. He was in his civilian coat, not his official one. He had no deputies with him. He stood on her porch in the dark with his hat in his hands and the expression of a man who has finally, after a considerable internal journey, arrived somewhere. "Can I come in?" he said. She stepped back. He sat down at the kitchen table. She put coffee in front of him. He wrapped his hands around the cup and looked at it for a moment before looking at her. "I've been doing some thinking," he said. "I gathered," she said. "I've been sheriff here for 8 years," he said. "Victor Hale was already established when I took the job. Already had the bank, already had the connections. And he was never. I want to be clear about this. He was never overtly corrupt. Nothing I could point to. Nothing that would stand up." He paused. "But there were things over the years. Complaints that went nowhere. Disputes that resolved in his favor in ways that weren't quite wrong, but weren't quite right either." He looked at her. "I told myself it was the way things worked. That this was frontier law, and you don't go after the most powerful man in the county over things you can't prove. You told yourself a comfortable thing, Clara said. Not harshly. Yes, he said. I did. He pulled something from his coat. A folded document. He laid it on the table between them. That's my own statement. About Hale's request regarding your property. That I was sent to your door on his behalf without legitimate legal basis to pressure you to vacate. Clara looked at the document, then at him. This could cost you, she said. I know. He'll make your life difficult. He already does, Briggs said quietly. I just used to pretend he didn't. He pushed the document slightly toward her. Thomas Whitmore vouched for me when I first came to this county. Nobody else was going to. He didn't know me. He said this man seems honest. Let's give him a chance. He paused. I don't know if I've always been worth that, but I'm trying to be worth it now. Clara picked up the document. 3 statements. The judge's affidavit. Douglas's written account. And now the sheriff's testimony against the man who employed him. It wasn't a perfect hand, but it was considerably stronger than the one she'd been dealt 11 days ago. Thank you, Sheriff, she said. Briggs, he said. Just Briggs. He finished his coffee and left. She sat alone for a long time after he was gone, looking at the 3 documents laid out on her brother's desk, and she thought about what Thomas had built here. Not just the land, not just the records, the human architecture of it, the slow, patient accumulation of trust, the decades of simply being decent to people, of showing up, of making room for others who were trying to find their feet. He had never thought of it as a strategy. She knew that. Thomas had been good to people because that was who he was, not because he was planning for the future. But the future had arrived anyway, and what he'd left behind was not just a deed and a metal box. It was a community of people who remembered him and were each in their own way and at their own cost trying to honor that memory. She was going to have to be worth that too. Friday arrived cold and clear. The church hall was the largest building in Silver Creek, a plain, practical space that smelled of candle wax and winter boots, and the particular density of a crowd that hadn't fully aired out since last Sunday. By 6:30, it was already nearly full, which told Clara everything she needed to know about how much appetite this county had for what was about to happen. She arrived at 10 to 7, with Wyatt on her left and Martha on her right, which was not an arrangement she'd planned, but which had assembled itself naturally the way right arrangements tend to. People watched her walk in. She had expected that. She had decided beforehand what she was going to do with being watched. Nothing. Just walk. Just be present. Just occupy the space that was hers to occupy. Hale was already there at the front with 2 men she didn't recognize, who had the look of lawyers, well-dressed, organized, carrying leather satchels, with the confidence of people who believe the room is already theirs. He saw her walk in. His expression didn't change. He nodded at her correctly, as one acknowledges an opponent. She nodded back. As one acknowledges someone who has underestimated them. She took a seat near the back, which was also deliberate. She was not going to go to the front and stand beside him as if this were equal ground. This was his meeting. She was here to speak when the moment came. The town councilman, who was chairing a nervous man named Abbott, who looked like he would rather be almost anywhere else, opened the meeting and gave the floor to Hale. Hale spoke for 20 minutes. He was very good. She had known he would be. He laid out the legal challenge to the deed, but he did it cleverly, not leading with law, leading with community, with the needs of the valley, with the water access that every rancher in the room depended on, and the uncertainty that this dispute created. He talked about the importance of clear legal ownership and the responsibility of local institutions to ensure that land transfers were above reproach. He never said Clara's name with contempt. He was far too good for that. He referred to her with sympathy as Thomas's bereaved sister, struggling with a complicated situation, perhaps in need of guidance. It was masterfully done. She gave him that. Then his lawyer stood up and walked through the legal argument. The alleged procedural defects. The questions of recording dates. The need for a court review that he implied with practiced reasonableness might take some considerable time, during which perhaps a different arrangement for the land might be more practical for all concerned. When they were done, Abbott asked if anyone else wished to speak. Clara stood up. The room went quiet, in a way that was different from before. The quality of attention changed, sharpened, shifted toward her with something that was not quite hostility and not quite sympathy, but was at its core simply human curiosity. They wanted to know who she was, what she was made of. The kind of knowing that happens not in private, but in public in the room with everyone watching. She walked to the front. She did not look at Hale. She looked at the room. "My name is Clara Whitmore," she said. "Thomas Whitmore was my brother. Most of you knew him better than I had the chance to, and I'm sorry for that, and I'm grateful to all of you for everything you've told me about him since I arrived." She let that sit for a moment. "I want to be clear about something before I say anything else," she continued. "I understand that this meeting was called about water access and land ownership. Those are legitimate concerns. Every rancher in this valley has a stake in those questions, and those questions deserve to be answered clearly." She paused. "So let me answer them clearly." She held up the deed. "This is the Whitmore land deed, recorded with the county on the 12th of March, 1884, transferred to me as Thomas's legal heir upon his death. The county recorder Douglas, who some of you know, has reviewed this deed 6 times and confirmed its validity in a written statement that I have with me." She held up the second document. "This is a signed affidavit from Judge Robert Harding of Millbrook, a retired federal judge who practiced law for 30 years. Judge Harding examined the promissory note that Mr. Hale's bank used to claim a lien against this property, and he attests in writing that the signature on that note is not Thomas Whitmore's signature." The room stirred. Not a murmur, more like a held breath releasing. She held up the third document. "And this is a statement from your own Sheriff Briggs, describing being asked by Mr. Hale's office to visit my property and pressure me to vacate without any legitimate legal authority to do so." The silence in the room was absolute. She looked at the room. Not at Hale, at the room. At the faces she'd been riding out to visit for 2 days. The ranchers who'd heard her out through doorways. The women who'd turned away on the street and then turned back. Douglas, who was sitting in the 3rd row with his hands clasped and his jaw set. Calhoun and Pete, who had shown up in the back and were standing with their arms crossed in the posture of men who have decided whose side they're on. "I'm not going to tell you what to believe," she said. "I'm going to ask you to look at what's in front of you." Her voice was even clear, carrying to the back of the room without strain. A forged signature. A sheriff sent to intimidate a woman on false grounds. A legal challenge filed the same week the forgery was exposed. She paused. "You know this valley. You know what it needs and what it doesn't. And I believe that you know the difference between a legal dispute and a campaign." She lowered her hands. "I came here because Thomas asked me to," she said, and her voice dropped slightly, became less formal and more direct. "I came because he believed this valley was worth coming to, worth staying in, worth building something in." She looked at the room. "I intend to stay. I intend to work this land, to use the water responsibly, to be a neighbor worth having. That's not a promise I'm making to a courtroom. That's a promise I'm making to you." She walked back to her seat. The room stayed quiet for a long moment. Then from somewhere in the middle, a man she recognized, one of the ranchers from her Wednesday visits, a weathered, straight-backed man named Garrett, stood up. "I knew Thomas Whitmore for 7 years, Garrett said. His voice was blunt and carrying. "He never lied to me once, never shortchanged me, never let me down." He looked toward the front of the room, not at Clara, at Hale. "I can't say the same for everyone in this room." He sat back down. Another man stood. Then a woman. Then Briggs himself, from the side wall where he'd been standing, stepped forward and said in his official voice that he had submitted his statement to the county attorney that morning, and that any questions about its contents could be directed to that office. Hale's lawyer tried to speak. Abbott, who had clearly been calculating which direction the wind was blowing with increasing anxiety, cut him off with the explanation that the meeting had been called to discuss community concerns, not legal proceedings, and that legal proceedings should be addressed in the appropriate venue. Hale said nothing. He sat very still at the front of the room, with the expression of a man who is recalculating. And Clara, looking at him for the first time, thought that she had finally, after weeks of maneuvering, surprised him. Not defeated him. He was not the kind of man who got defeated in a single evening. But she had surprised him, and she had surprised him in front of everyone who mattered, and that was something he could not take back. He looked at her just once across the room. She held his gaze. He looked away first. She did not let herself feel triumphant. She was not done. She knew she was not done. There would be a court date, and there would be lawyers, and there would be months of uncertainty and expense, and there was no guarantee of how it ended. She was not naive about that. But something had shifted in that room. Something that would not shift back. Outside afterward, in the cold, people came to speak to her. Not everyone. Not even most. But enough. Garrett shook her hand with both of his. Douglas nodded at her from a distance, with an expression of visible relief. Two women she didn't know introduced themselves as neighbors from the east side of the valley, and said they'd heard she was starting something for women who wanted to learn to read, and they had names to give her if she was serious. She said she was serious. She said it, and she meant it, and the meaning of it surprised her a little, the way genuine intention sometimes surprises you when it arrives, as if it crept up while you were looking at something else. Wyatt found her in the crowd when it was thinning. He stopped beside her, not touching, just present, and she felt the warmth of his proximity in the cold air. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. They stood together, watching the last of the crowd disperse into the dark, and she felt the fatigue of the last weeks settle into her bones, like the cold, not unpleasant exactly, but real. Present. The weight of having done something that mattered and knowing it is not finished and being all right with that. "I need to tell you something," Wyatt said. She looked at him. I was looking at the road ahead, not at her in the particular way he had of not quite meeting her eyes when he was saying something that cost him something. "When I first went to the depot," he said, "those weeks before you arrived, I'll be honest with you, I went because Thomas asked me to. That's all it was at first. A favor to a man I respected." A pause. "The third week I was going because I wanted to be there when you stepped off. I didn't know you. I'd read your brother's letters about you. I'd heard him talk about you. And I wanted to be the person who was there when you arrived." She didn't speak. "I'm telling you now," he said, "because I think you deserve to know why someone was waiting for you. Not just because they were asked, because they wanted to be." She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the woman who had stepped off that train. The crumpled letter. The empty platform. The cold. She thought about a voice saying "you're safe now," and the way those words had landed in some unguarded place. "Wyatt," she said. He looked at her then, finally, directly. "Thank you," she said, "for being there." A pause. "And for telling me why." He nodded. Once. The kind of nod that is a whole conversation. They walked back to where the horses were tied side by side in the dark, not touching, not talking, but something between them that had no name yet and didn't need one. The land was still hers. The fight was not over. Victor Hale would file his motions, and his attorneys would argue, and the court would take its time, and there would be hard days ahead that she couldn't fully see yet. But she had stood in front of a full room and spoken the truth in her own voice, and the room had heard her, and she had not flinched. The last time she'd stood in a public room and needed to be believed, she'd lost. This time, something was different, and the difference she understood as she rode home through the cold dark toward the house that was hers was not the room, not the audience, not even the evidence, though the evidence helped. The difference was her. She had arrived in Silver Creek like something broken, like a woman held together by the force of having nowhere else to go. And somewhere between the empty depot and the church hall, between Thomas's letters and Wyatt's steady presence and Martha's spare coat, and Harding's careful handwriting, and Douglas's shaking hands, and Briggs coming to her door at 10 o'clock at night with a statement he didn't have to write somewhere. In all of that, something had knit back together. Not the same as before. Different. Stronger in the broken places the way things sometimes are. She rode home to her valley. She had work to do in the morning. The court date was set for the second week of March, 6 weeks away. 6 weeks during which Clara did not slow down, did not hold her breath, did not spend her mornings staring at the horizon, waiting for the next blow to land. She had learned somewhere in the grinding weeks behind her that waiting was its own kind of surrender, that the best defense against a man who wanted you to feel small was to be visibly, actively, undeniably large. So she worked. The south field that Calhoun and Pete had helped her clear was ready for spring planting by mid-January. She did not know enough about Colorado soil to know exactly what to plant. So she asked. She asked Garrett, who had shaken her hand with both of his at the town meeting and had since become a reliable source of practical knowledge delivered in the fewest possible words. She asked the woman named Ruth, who ran the dry goods store on Main Street, and who had been farming this valley since before Silver Creek had a name. She asked Wyatt, who knew more than he usually said about growing things, which she was learning was a pattern with him depth that only revealed itself when directly asked for. She planted what they told her. She learned as she planted. She also started the reading class. It began with 3 women. Douglas's wife's mother, a small, fierce woman named Aggie, who approached the alphabet with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting decades for this and was not going to waste a minute, and 2 others who had introduced themselves after the town meeting. Within 2 weeks, there were 7. Within a month, 11. They came twice a week to the Whitmore house, sitting around Thomas's kitchen table with their primers and their determination, and Clara taught them with the same directness she'd been taught with as a child, before the world had started telling her that a woman's education was ornamental rather than functional. Aggie, on her 3rd week, read her first full sentence aloud without stopping. Clara had been ready for that moment, to be quiet, ordinary, unremarkable, in the way that learning often is from the outside. Aggie put the primer down and pressed both hands flat on the table and looked at the words she had just read, as if she was looking at something sacred. Then she looked up at Clara with her eyes bright and said, "I want to read Thomas's letters." Clara's throat closed. She said, "I'll bring them next week." She rode home that evening and sat in the dark for a long time. Long time, not sad exactly, but full in the way. A room is full when it has finally been used for the purpose it was made for. The legal case moved slowly. The way legal cases do. One document answered by another document. One argument requiring a counter-argument. Every step through channels that were deliberately narrow and deliberately slow. Aldrich arrived from Denver in the 3rd week of January. A compact, impatient man of perhaps 45, who walked into the Whitmore house, looked at the stack of documentation Clara had assembled, and said nothing for 2 full minutes. Then he said, "Your brother was thorough." "Yes," Clara said. "He was." This is a stronger position than Harding's letter suggested. He picked up a document, set it down. The forgery alone is significant. If we can get that in front of the judge before Hale's team buries it in procedural motions. "Can we?" Clara asked. Aldrich looked at her. He had the slightly startled expression of a lawyer who has walked into a meeting expecting to explain things and discovered he doesn't need to. "Probably," he said. "Harding's affidavit carries weight, combined with the sheriff's statement." He stopped. "How did you get Briggs?" "I told him the truth," Clara said. "And I gave him the chance to decide who he wanted to be." Aldrich looked at her for a moment. "You should have been a lawyer," he said. "I should have been many things," she said. "I'm working with what I have." He nodded a small, precise nod and opened his briefcase. "Then let's get to work." They worked through that day and most of the next. Aldrich was not warm exactly, but he was direct, and direct was what Clara needed. He told her exactly where they were strong and exactly where they were exposed, and he did not cushion either assessment, which she appreciated more than he probably knew. The weak point, he told her, was timing. The deed challenge rested partly on the claim that the original recording had procedural gaps. Hale's lawyers would argue those gaps at length. The forgery case was strong, but it was a separate proceeding, a criminal matter, not a civil one, and keeping the two connected in the court's mind was going to require careful maneuvering. "We need something that ties it all together," Aldrich said on the second evening, spreading papers across Thomas's desk with the absorbed focus of a man solving a problem he has decided is solvable. Something that demonstrates not just individual misconduct, but a pattern, a deliberate campaign. He tapped the stack of Thomas's records. These are good. But if there were anyone else, anyone who experienced similar pressure from Hale and could speak to it. He left the sentence open, Clara thought. She thought about everything she'd heard over the past weeks. The conversations at doorways. The careful language people used about Hale, never quite accusing, always slightly oblique, the language of people who have learned to be cautious. She thought about Garrett saying, "I can't say the same for everyone in this room." She thought about Briggs saying there were things over the years. She thought about Martha, who had lived in this valley for 30 years, and had, Clara was certain, seen considerably more than she'd mentioned. She rode to see Garrett the next morning. She didn't explain herself at length. She sat in his kitchen with his wife, a practical woman named Helen, who had the look of someone who had always known more than her husband, and was used to it, and she said simply, "Aldrich needs to know if anyone else in this valley has experienced what I've documented, directly, on record." Garrett and Helen looked at each other. "How far back?" Garrett said. "As far as anyone remembers," Clara said. Another look between them. Something passing in that glance, the long-married language of two people deciding together whether to step off a ledge they've been standing at the edge of for years. Helen said, "The Hennessy family." "Martha mentioned them," Clara said. "They sold 4 years ago." "They didn't sell because they wanted to," Helen said flatly. "They sold because Hale made it impossible not to. I know what he did to them. May Hennessy told me herself." She looked at Clara steadily. "May and her husband moved to Pueblo. They're still there." Clara looked at her for a moment. "Would they be willing to speak to it?" "I don't know," Helen said. "But I'd be willing to write to May and ask." 2 days later, a letter went to Pueblo. Within a week, a letter came back. May Hennessy was willing to speak to it. She had been willing to speak to it for 4 years. She had simply never been asked by anyone with the capacity to do something with what she said. Aldrich. When Clara put May's letter in front of him, was quiet for a moment that was longer than his usual silences. "This changes the shape of the case," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "It does. A pattern of behavior, multiple victims, documented over years." He looked at her with something she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite respect exactly, but the adjusted estimation of a man recalibrating upward. "You've been building this since you got here." "My brother built most of it," she said. "I'm finishing what he started." Aldrich looked at Thomas's records, then at her. "He would be proud of you," he said. It was coming from a man who rationed sentiment with the precision of a pharmacist, the equivalent of a speech. "I know," she said quietly. "I'm working on believing that." February moved. The reading class grew. The Southfield waited under cold ground. Aldrich made trips between Silver Creek and Denver, filing motions, responding to Hale's motions, doing the careful procedural work that Clara could understand but not execute, which was why she'd needed him. She managed her own records, her own accounts, the day-to-day work of the land, and the slow accumulating work of being present in the community. Present in a way that was becoming less deliberate and more natural. The way things become natural when you stop performing them and start simply doing them. She stopped counting the days since she'd arrived. That was how she knew she'd stopped waiting to leave. Wyatt came every day. Not always for long sometimes, just to check on something practical. The water access on the south boundary. The condition of a fence shared between their properties. The kind of thing that provides legitimate cover for presence, when the real reason for presence is more complicated and less nameable. She did not name it. He did not name it. They worked alongside each other and talked about practical things, and occasionally about impractical things. And once on an evening in the 3rd week of February, when the light was doing something extraordinary that neither of them mentioned. They sat on the porch, and he told her about the years before Silver Creek, and she told him about the years before Boston became unbearable, and they talked until the cold drove them inside. She noticed that she'd stopped being careful around him. Stopped weighing each word before she spoke. It stopped maintaining the margin of distance that had been for years her primary self-protective instinct. She noticed it, and she didn't rebuild it. She just let it be what it was. March arrived. 2 days before the court date, Victor Hale came to her door. No lawyers this time. No deputies in the road. Just Hale alone on horseback, arriving at the Whitmore gate in the early morning and dismounting with the deliberate, unhurried movement of a man who has decided something and has come to deliver that decision in person. Clara opened the door before he knocked. He looked at her for a moment. In the weeks since the town meeting, she had seen him at a distance in town at the general store once outside the courthouse when Aldrich had needed her signature on a filing. Each time he had nodded at her with that same correct impersonal acknowledgement. Each time she had nodded back. This was different. His expression was different. The authority was still there, that deep, practiced quality of a man who has been the most powerful person in every room for 20 years. But something had shifted in it. A hairline crack. Barely visible. She might have missed it a month ago. She didn't miss it now. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Come in." He came in. He sat not across the desk this time, but at the kitchen table, which was different, and she thought intentional. The kitchen table was where people sat when they were not performing, when they were being as much as they were capable real. She made coffee. She set it in front of him. She sat across from him and waited. He looked at his hands for a moment. A gesture she had never seen from him, that downward look, that brief private consultation. It told her more than anything he'd said in all their previous interactions. "I'm going to drop the legal challenge," he said. She said nothing. She kept her expression level and her breathing even, and she waited for the rest. "Not because I've lost," he said, looking up. "I want to be clear about that. I have resources you don't have. I could continue this for years. Make it expensive enough that you'd eventually have to consider your options." He paused. "I want to be clear that I could do that." "I understand," she said. "Why won't you?" He was quiet for a moment. A real quiet, not strategic, not calculated, but the quiet of a man actually thinking. "Because May Hennessy agreed to testify," he said. "And the moment that becomes part of the record, this stops being about a deed dispute. It becomes something I can't control the shape of." He looked at her directly. "I've spent 20 years in this valley, Miss Whitmore. I've built something here. I didn't start out meaning to be what I became." Something moved across his face that was not quite regret, and not quite anything else she had a word for. "But somewhere along the way, I stopped distinguishing between what I was building and what I was taking. And those are different things." The room was very quiet. "Is that an apology?" she said carefully. "It's an explanation," he said. "I'm not sure I've earned the right to apologize." She thought about that for a moment. About what a person does with an explanation from a man who has spent months trying to take what was hers, who had forged her dead brother's signature, who had sent a sheriff to her door on false grounds and circulated her most painful history through a town that didn't know her, weaponizing her past as casually as he'd weaponized everything else. She thought about whether explanation offered honestly and without defense was worth anything. She decided it was worth something. Not everything. Something. "The Hennessy family," she said. "Can you make that right?" He looked at her. "They sold below value," she said. "Under pressure they shouldn't have been subjected to. That can't be undone. But there are things that can be done." He was quiet for a long moment. "That's not why you brought May Hennessy into this," he said, not accusing, observing. "No," she agreed. "It wasn't. But it's what I'm asking for now." Another long silence. She could see him calculating, not the aggressive calculation of before, but something slower, more uncomfortable. The calculation of a man who is trying to figure out what's right rather than what wins. "I'll contact their attorney," he said finally. "Good," she said. He stood up. He put on his hat. He looked around the room, not with ownership this time, not with the appraising eye of a man measuring what could be his. Just looked with the expression of someone taking stock of what is genuinely someone else's and acknowledging it. "Your brother," he said at the door. "He never stopped talking to me. Even when I was making his life difficult. He'd still stop me on the street and ask how things were and mean it." He paused. "I used to think that was weakness. I've revised that opinion." He left. Clara stood at the door and watched him ride back down the road toward Silver Creek. She stood there for a long time. Then she went inside, sat at Thomas's desk, and wrote a letter to May Hennessy in Pueblo, telling her that the case had resolved that her testimony had mattered, even though it would not be needed in court, and that if she and her husband ever wanted to come back to Silver Creek, there was a neighbor here who would be glad to see them. She sent the letter with Pete. Then she went out to the south field and worked until her hands were dirty and her back ached and the cold had gotten all the way into her, and she didn't care. The next morning, Aldrich received formal notice that the legal challenge had been withdrawn. The Whitmore deed stood. The lien was dissolved. Every document Hale had filed was retracted. Aldrich rode out to tell her in person, which she sensed was not his usual practice, and which she appreciated accordingly. He stood on her porch and said, "It's over." She looked at him. "The legal part," she said. He almost smiled, a precise, economical almost smile. "The legal part," he agreed. "The rest is up to you." He shook her hand and rode back to Denver, and Clara stood on the porch of her house in the cold March morning and breathed. Just breathed. The court date came and went with nothing to settle. The county recorder filed the final confirmation. Judge Harding received a letter from Aldrich and wrote back to Clara directly, 3 lines in his precise hand, saying he was glad justice had found its way without a trial, and that Thomas would have been characteristically unsurprised. She read that 3 times. She tucked it into the metal box with the deed and the other documents, and she kept the box not under the desk anymore, but on top of it, in plain sight. Because she was done with things that needed to be hidden. Spring came to Whitmore Valley, the way spring comes to high country. Slowly at first, then all at once with the aggressive certainty of something that has been waiting and is done waiting. The south field that had been cold ground in January started showing green in the 3rd week of March. Clara stood at the edge of it one morning and looked at the first signs of what she'd planted and felt something she didn't have an exact word for. Not pride. Exactly not relief. Something older and simpler than either. The feeling of a seed doing what seeds do when you give them what they need. Aggie read her first paragraph that week, from Thomas's letters, as Clara had promised. She read the part where he described the valley the way he'd written about it in his letters to Clara, trying to make her see it the way he saw it. "You'd love it here, little sister. The land doesn't care who you used to be. It just asks what you're going to do next." Aggie read it aloud slowly, stopping once to correct herself, and when she finished, she looked up and said, "He was right." Clara nodded. She didn't trust her voice. "He was right about you too," Aggie added with the directness of a woman who had decided at whatever age she was to say exactly what she meant. "He wrote about you in almost every letter I ever heard read to me. Said you were the strongest person he knew who hadn't figured that out yet." Clara looked at the primer on the table between them. At the words Aggie had just read. At the hands of a woman who had waited decades to read and was now reading every week in a kitchen that had become the place where that happened. "I'm starting to figure it out," Clara said. She meant it. She was also terrified of meaning it, which was how she knew it was real. The evening that Aldrich's final paperwork was confirmed fully officially, without any remaining question. Wyatt came to the house. He knocked, which he'd stopped doing weeks ago, which was itself a thing she'd noticed and not remarked on, and his knocking now meant something different. Meant he'd thought about this visit beforehand, which meant this was not a practical call. She opened the door. Hal was standing with his hat in his hands, the gesture she'd first seen from men who had come to her door with difficult things, but his expression was not difficult. It was the expression of a man who has arrived at something after a long journey and is not entirely sure how to announce his arrival. "It's done," he said. "I know," she said. "How does it feel?" She thought about that. Really thought the way the question deserved. "Strange," she said. "I've been fighting for so long I'm not entirely sure what I do when I stop." "You don't stop," he said. "You just start fighting for something different. Something you're building instead of defending." She looked at him. "Is that what you do?" "I'm learning to," he said. Something shifted in his voice. "I've spent a lot of years doing things because they needed doing. Running the ranch, looking after things being useful. And I'm good at useful. He looked at her steadily. "But I've been thinking lately that useful isn't the same as wanted. And I've been useful to a lot of people in my life and wanted by not very many." The air in the doorway changed. She held his gaze. She did not look away, which was a choice, and they both knew it was a choice. "Wyatt," she said. "I'm not asking for anything," he said quickly. "I want to be clear about that. I know this last year has been—" "Wyatt," she said again, quieter. He stopped. "You were waiting for me," she said. "At the depot, for weeks." "Yes," he said. "You didn't have to do that." "No," he said. "I know. But you did it anyway." She paused. "Not because Thomas asked you to." He held her gaze. "Not only because Thomas asked me to," he said, honest. She thought about a platform in the dark, and a voice saying, "You're safe now," and the way those words had cracked something open that she hadn't known was sealed. She thought about 4 miles in the dark on horseback and comfortable silence. And "What do you need?" asked without agenda. She thought about someone who told her hard truths and stood behind her in a courtroom crowd and did not fight her battles for her, but was always in the space just behind her own 2 feet. She thought about what Thomas had written. "She's been taking up less space than she deserves for years. Don't let her." "Come in," she said. "I just made coffee." He came in. They sat at the kitchen table, Thomas's kitchen table, her kitchen table, and they talked for a long time. Not about the land or the case or the spring planting or any of the practical things that had organized their days for months. They talked about themselves. About the lives they'd had before this valley, and the people they'd been, and the things they'd lost, and the things they'd thought they'd lost, that turned out to be only dormant, waiting for the right conditions. He told her about his wife who had died 6 years ago of fever, and the way grief had become without his quite deciding it. The primary organizing principle of his life had become the shape he moved through the world, in until he couldn't remember what shape he'd been before. She told him about Boston. Really told him not the facts which he knew, but the feeling of it. The specific texture of being publicly disbelieved. The way it had gotten inside her and become a voice that sounded like her own voice, saying, "Not credible, not enough, too much wrong." He listened the way he always listened. Complete. Without judgment. Without the subtle flinching that people sometimes did when you told them the full weight of something. When she was done, he said, "You know that voice is lying." "Most days," she said. "What about today?" She thought about the South Field. Aggie reading Thomas's words. Hale at the kitchen table saying, "I stopped distinguishing between what I was building and what I was taking." The metal box on the desk in plain sight. The letter from Harding. "Today," she said, "I know it's lying." "Good," he said. And there was something in the simplicity of that, not effusive, not elaborate, just good, as if her knowing that was exactly what it was. Good that made her believe it slightly more than she had 5 minutes ago. They stayed at that table until the coffee was cold, and the fire needed another log, and the night outside was completely dark and completely quiet. The mountain quiet that she had at first found unnerving, and had come to understand was not empty, but full of land and cold, and the kind of vastness that made you either very small or very clear, and she had chosen clear. He put another log on the fire. She watched him do it, that simple habitual gesture. Someone taking care of the warmth in a room, and understood something that she had been circling for weeks without landing on directly. She was not alone in this house anymore. Not because of the log on the fire, not because of his presence in the room, but because of what that presence had accumulated into slowly over months, in the way that important things accumulate, not all at once, not announced, but built up day by day, until one day you look, and it's there, solid and real, and you can't quite say when it happened. She was not alone. The next morning she stood on the porch of her house, her valley, her field, just beginning to green below her, and she felt the cold morning air and the particular quality of Colorado light that she had stopped noticing, because she was used to it now, because it was hers now, because things stop being remarkable when they become home. Wyatt came around the side of the house from the barn, which he'd checked on the way in out of habit. He stopped beside her on the porch and looked out at the valley with her. "Do you still think coming west was a mistake?" he said. She heard the echo of something Thomas might have asked. The question that her brother, if he'd been alive and standing on this porch, would have asked with a particular kind of knowing that was not quite teasing and not quite solemn. She thought about the woman who had stepped off that train. The crumpled letter. The empty platform. The station master's face. She thought about everything that woman had not known was coming: the ledger and the affidavit and the town meeting and the forged signature and Aggie's hands on the table and Garrett standing up in the church hall and Briggs coming to her door at 10 at night and Victor Hale sitting in this kitchen and looking at his hands. She thought about all of it. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go," she said. "I thought that was the worst reason to arrive somewhere." She paused. "It turned out to be the only reason I needed." Wyatt was quiet beside her for a moment. Thomas used to say, he said, that the best things that happened to him in this valley happened because he ran out of other options. He looked at her. He said necessity was just opportunity wearing a harder coat. She felt something rise in her chest. Not quite a laugh, not quite a cry, something exactly in between: the feeling of truth arriving in a form you didn't expect, and finding it was precisely what you needed. She thought about what she'd built in 4 months. Not the farm, though the farm was coming slowly and surely, and with her hands dirty every day. Not the legal victory, though she had earned that, and was not going to minimize it. Not even the community she was beginning carefully and honestly to belong to. She had built herself back. Not the Clara Whitmore, who had arrived at Silver Creek with a crumpled letter and nowhere to go. Someone different. Someone who had stood in front of a full room and been believed. Someone who had looked at a powerful man and not flinched. Someone who taught women to read around a kitchen table and kept her brother's letters in a box on the desk in plain sight, and had learned finally and at cost how much space she was allowed to take up. She was still learning. She was going to be learning for the rest of her life. That was all right. Learning meant moving, and moving meant she was not standing still in the ruins of someone else's story about who she was. She was writing her own story now, in this valley, on this land, with these people. She reached out and took Wyatt's hand, not because she needed steadying, not because she was afraid, but because she had been taking up less space than she deserved for years, and she was done with that, and this was what she wanted, and she was allowed to want it. He didn't say anything. He just held on. They stood there together in the morning light, looking out over Whitmore Valley, the water that fed 12 ranches, the field just beginning to green, the house that was hers, and only hers, the ground that a dead man had loved and a living woman had fought for, and would now spend the rest of her life learning to deserve. Clara Whitmore had arrived in Silver Creek with nothing but a crumpled letter and the specific desperation of a woman with nowhere left to go. She had found in that desperation something no one could take from her. Not a man, not a house, not a legal deed, though she had those too. She had found herself the version of herself that had always been there, waiting underneath the fear and the shame and the long habit of making herself small, and she had brought that self forward into the light in front of a whole town, on ground that was hers, and she had not apologized for a single inch of it. The woman who had been left at the depot in tears was gone. The woman who stood on this porch in this morning light, holding the hand of a good man and looking out at the valley she had earned, that woman was just beginning.